Before we start, please make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. Also, can you please tell me from where and what time you're watching? Thanks.
The first thing that struck me was the silence. A dead, suffocating quiet that settled over the waters like a shroud. I'd grown up along the coast of Mississippi, the Gulf of Mexico, practically a second home to me. But that day, as we drifted deeper into the endless oil-slicked expanse, the water felt different. Not alive. Not dead, something in between. I've faced storms that lit the horizon on fire and waterspouts that threatened to swallow boats whole. Those were thrilling, sure, but predictable in their chaos. What I experienced during the Deepwater Horizon spill in 2010 was something else entirely, something that clawed at your mind and stayed with you no matter how many showers you took to scrub it off. When the oil rig exploded, spewing crude like black blood into the Gulf, BP scrambled to piece together a cleanup operation. They invited boat owners to join the effort, promising good pay and the chance to help restore our wounded waters. I didn't hesitate. The Gulf wasn't just where I lived, it was part of me. I got my hazmat certification and joined a fleet of fishing and charter boats repurposed for cleanup. My first assignment was on a 127-foot vessel that ferried clients to the Chandeleur Islands for fishing trips. Those islands are a paradise, or at least they were. Now they looked like something out of a post-apocalyptic nightmare, stained and smothered by thick, viscous oil. For weeks my job was simple: search for crude slicks, log their locations, and report back. The waters we scouted turned darker each day, the oil clinging to everything it touched like a disease. Then came the day that changed everything. We were nearly 100 miles offshore when we hit the thickest oil yet, 6 inches deep in most spots, a foot in others. The stench hit you first, sharp and acrid, burning your throat before you even stepped out onto the deck. The water didn't look like water anymore. It was a black, sluggish mass, churning and writhing like it was alive. And then we found the life jacket. It floated there, half submerged in the sludge, the name on it scrawled and faded but still legible. It belonged to one of the workers from the rig, a man who never made it home. I don't know why, but I reached out and grabbed it. The fabric was slick with oil, cold to the touch, and I swear it felt like it pulsed in my hands. It was as if the Gulf itself was trying to speak, to scream its agony. From that moment, nothing felt the same. The cleanup shifted into high gear, and our small fleet was tasked with more than just reporting. We donned hazmat suits and worked in suffocating heat, wrangling the crude with skimmers and booms, sweating under layers of protective gear as the oil seeped into every crack and crevice it could find. The sight of dead fish and sea turtles became our new normal, and I began to feel like we were fighting a losing battle against something far beyond our control. One day, while working about 20 miles past the Barrier Islands, we saw something on the horizon that stopped us cold. The water ahead was boiling, or at least it looked like it. Reds, oranges, and yellows swirled together in a mesmerizing, almost hypnotic display. As we drew closer, we realized it wasn't the water, but a massive school of redfish and jack crevalle, their bodies shimmering and writhing in unison. It should have been beautiful. It should have been a sign of life. But all I could think about was the life jacket. The school stretched as far as we could see, hundreds of yards wide, a kaleidoscope of scales against the grim backdrop of the oil-stained Gulf. For a brief moment I felt hope. Maybe what we were doing wasn't in vain. Maybe the Gulf could heal. But then I noticed the fish weren't swimming. They were struggling. The oil was suffocating them, dragging them down like unseen hands, pulling them into the depths. The Gulf was still bleeding, still crying out, and we were powerless to stop it. To this day, I can't shake the memories. The sight of the slick, black water swallowing the horizon. The sound of the silence out there, so profound it felt like a curse. And that life jacket, bobbing lifelessly in the current. A grim reminder of the lives lost and the scars left behind. They say the Gulf is healing now, that the marine life is slowly returning, but I know better. Beneath the waves, buried in the sediment, the oil still lingers, waiting, and every now and then when the waters are calm and the air is still, I think I can hear it. A faint whisper carried on the wind, a warning, a plea, a curse. There's something about being underwater that makes you feel utterly vulnerable, a world where the rules of survival shift and danger lurks in silence. If I'd known how close I'd come to death, I would never have stepped onto that boat in Bali. I was a scuba instructor back then, leading a group of young vacationers on an underwater walking excursion. They were a lively bunch, couples and friends in their early 20s, buzzing with excitement. For most of them, this was a fun novelty. For me, it was supposed to be just another day at work. It wasn't. The mothership was a larger boat we used as a base for diving, but it had its quirks. Painted on its hull was a massive, ominous alien head, a tongue-in-cheek nod to its name. The group loved it, snapping pictures and laughing as we approached. Little did I know that painted face would haunt my memory in the weeks to come. Underwater walking itself was a newer activity at the time. Instead of traditional scuba gear, we used sci-fi-looking helmets connected to oxygen tubes that floated on the surface. It was supposed to be safer, easier. It wasn't. As the first to descend, I felt the weight of the helmet immediately pulling me downward. The sensation was unnerving. The pressure mounted quickly, making my ears throb until I yawned and swallowed to adjust. Even breathing felt strange. Every inhale created a vacuum, forcing me to pause as the helmet refilled with air. I chalked it up to part of the experience and motioned for the others to follow. Once everyone was underwater, the guide handed us bags of bread to attract fish. Within seconds, the water swarmed with vibrant, darting creatures, rushing against us like curious ghosts. The group was delighted, their laughter muffled by the helmets. But for me, the constant whir of the oxygen tube was an unsettling reminder of our reliance on the surface. And then it happened. The sound stopped. For a moment I froze, expecting the system to kick back in just as it had earlier. 2 seconds passed, then 3. The air returned and I exhaled in relief, telling myself it was just a minor hiccup. But it wasn't over. The interruption happened again, lasting a few seconds longer this time. I glanced at the guide, who didn't seem concerned. Still, the unease in my chest grew heavier. My instincts told me something was off, but I pushed the thought aside. The guide motioned for me to follow him over a railing, leading me along a narrow path flanked by sharp corals. The current was stronger here, tugging at my air tube and making every step a struggle. I looked back at the group to ensure they were following. They were, or so I thought. And then the whir stopped again. This time it didn't come back. 5 seconds. I tried to stay calm. 10 seconds. My chest tightened. 15 seconds. The training drilled into me screamed, "Don't panic!" But panic doesn't listen to logic. I signaled to the guide, pounding my chest in the universal sign for I can't breathe. He turned, his expression unreadable through his mask, then started moving away. My mind raced. Was he leading me to safety or abandoning me? The pressure in my lungs became unbearable. Water started seeping into the helmet, each droplet a harbinger of doom. I tilted my head back, desperately sucking at the diminishing pocket of air. My vision blurred, and the world around me felt distant, like I was sinking into an abyss. 30 seconds. My body screamed for oxygen, but my mind kept replaying the risks of removing the helmet, getting the bends, hitting my head on the boat, or simply drowning before I reached the surface. 40 seconds. I clung to the guide, my grip ironclad, as if holding him could anchor me to life. Then I saw it, the ladder leading up to the boat. Adrenaline surged through me. With every ounce of strength, I reached for the ladder, my fingers fumbling against the rungs as the helmet distorted my perception. When I finally grasped it, I pulled myself upward with everything I had. As my head broke the surface, air flooded back into the helmet. I gasped, sucking in lungfuls of sweet, life-giving oxygen. Relief crashed over me like a tidal wave, but it was short-lived. Looking back, I don't know what haunted me more: the suffocating moments underwater, or the realization that down there, you're utterly at the mercy of the equipment, the guides, and the depths themselves. I quit being a scuba instructor not long after that. To this day, the thought of descending into the ocean fills me with dread. I don't recommend underwater walking, not to anyone. The year was 1941, a time when the seas were restless, not just from storms, but from the silent predators lurking beneath. I was aboard the SS Britannia, a vessel that promised safe passage to India amidst the chaos of war. Little did I know, the ship carried more than its passengers. It bore secrets, and perhaps something far darker. The night before departure from Liverpool, I had a dream, vivid and unsettling. I saw a vast ocean stretching endlessly, its surface shimmering unnaturally under a blood-red moon. In the distance, a shadowy figure stood on the water, pointing directly at me. When I woke up, I laughed it off as pre-departure nerves. But now, looking back, I wish I had heeded the warning. We set sail on March 11th, 1941. At first, the journey seemed uneventful, save for the constant rolling of the ship that left me seasick for days. The ship's escorts, a few destroyers and an armed merchant cruiser, were supposed to ensure our safety, but something about their presence felt futile, like a fragile barrier against an inevitable fate. Then came March 25th. The morning was oppressively hot, the kind that clings to your skin and drains your energy. I was lying on my bunk, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it. A low, guttural hum that seemed to vibrate through the very bones of the ship. It wasn't the engine. It was something alive. Moments later, a thunderous explosion shattered the eerie calm. I stumbled to the porthole and saw fountains of water erupting around the ship. The tannoy crackled to life, the voice of the captain trembling as he announced we were under attack by a German raiding vessel. Panic spread like wildfire. Soldiers barked orders, passengers screamed, and the ship groaned as if it were alive and in agony. I ran to the deck, only to be met with chaos. The enemy shells were relentless, and the air was thick with smoke and fear. Our small rear gun tried to fight back, but its efforts were silenced with a deafening blast. The crew manning it were gone, obliterated in an instant. The lifeless bodies of those who had once been my fellow passengers and crew now littered the deck, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. Then came the order we dreaded. Abandon ship. I joined the desperate crowd scrambling for lifeboats. There was no sense of order, just raw primal survival. By sheer luck, I managed to find a lifeboat that wasn't damaged. As we lowered it into the churning sea, the cries of those left behind echoed in my ears, their voices fading into the smoke and fire as the Britannia was pummeled into submission. But the true horror was yet to come. As we drifted away from the burning wreck, I saw it. The German raiding ship, its deck lined with men, their faces devoid of emotion as they finished the job. A final barrage of shells struck below the Britannia's waterline, and the ship let out a sound I'll never forget. A mournful, almost human wail before disappearing beneath the waves. We were adrift for days, baking under the relentless sun, tormented by the ceaseless presence of sharks. They circled us like specters, their dead black eyes watching, waiting. The faintest splash would draw them closer, their fins slicing through the water, a chilling reminder of how fragile our existence had become. One man in our lifeboat, a quiet fellow who had barely spoken since the attack, finally cracked. Without a word, he stood, put on his overcoat, and stepped overboard. The sea swallowed him whole, his body disappearing before we could even cry out. His heavy clothing dragged him into the abyss, but his final act stayed with us, a haunting symbol of despair. The nights were the worst. The ocean was eerily still, the silence broken only by the soft lapping of waves against the lifeboat. But there were moments, fleeting yet unforgettable, when we heard whispers. They came from nowhere, faint and unintelligible, as if the sea itself was speaking. Some of us dismissed it as the wind. Others were too afraid to say what we were all thinking, that the voices belonged to those who had perished, their souls trapped in the water, calling out to us. By the time we were rescued, we were barely alive. A Spanish vessel spotted our flare, and we were pulled aboard, weak and delirious. As I climbed the rope ladder, my hands blistered and bleeding, I couldn't help but glance back at the ocean. For a moment, I thought I saw it again, the shadowy figure from my dream, standing on the waves, watching us. Even now, decades later, I can't escape the memories. The ocean's whispers still haunt me, and in the quiet moments of the night, I hear the wail of the Britannia as it sank. Some say the sea forgets, but I know better. It remembers. The darkness of the Atlantic was a living thing, its waves whispering promises of death. The storm was ferocious, battering Stephen Callahan's one-man sailboat, Napoleon Solo, like a toy in the hands of an angry child. But it wasn't just the storm he had to fear. That night, under a moonless sky, something massive, something unseen, collided with the boat. The sickening crack of splintering wood filled the air, followed by an ominous gurgling as seawater rushed in. Callahan's worst nightmare was unfolding. His vessel, the culmination of his expertise as a naval architect, was dying beneath his feet. In the chaos, the sea seemed alive, eager to claim him. Forced to abandon ship, Callahan scrambled into his tiny lifeboat just as Napoleon Solo vanished into the abyss. Alone, drenched and shivering, he drifted aimlessly as the first light of dawn crept over the endless horizon. But the fight for survival had only begun. Before the Napoleon Solo sank, Callahan had salvaged what little he could: a spear gun, emergency rations, a sleeping bag, and 2 solar stills for water. As an experienced sailor, he understood the unforgiving nature of the ocean. He charted his survival plan. The Atlantic's currents and trade winds would eventually drift him towards civilization, if he could stay alive. The food rations didn't last long. Hunger clawed at his stomach, gnawing away at his strength and will. Desperate, Callahan turned to the spear gun. He knew the ocean's secret. Flotsam often became ecosystems, attracting fish and inevitably predators. It wasn't long before schools of mahi-mahi gathered around his lifeboat. His survival seemed possible, but the ocean is a cruel provider. Where small fish thrive, larger predators follow. One morning as the sea calmed, Callahan awoke to a sound that froze his blood, a soft lapping against the sides of his raft. He peered over the edge and saw them, 3 dorsal fins slicing through the water, moving in perfect circles. Sharks. The predators were enormous, their sandpaper skins scraping against the flimsy nylon walls of his raft. They could smell him. Callahan's breath came in ragged gasps as he realized the truth. The sharks weren't just curious. They were hunting. With trembling hands, he grabbed his spear gun. The weapon felt pitifully inadequate, but he had no choice. Leaning over the side, he jabbed at the circling beasts. Their thick, rubbery skin resisted the strikes, and within hours, his spear gun broke. Undeterred, Callahan lashed a knife to the shaft and continued the fight. Days turned into weeks. Callahan's body weakened, his mind teetering on the edge of madness. His solar stills, the fragile lifeline providing drinkable water, began to fail. Every breath was a struggle. Every moment felt like his last. Then came the tipping point. On the 44th day, Callahan caught a large mahi-mahi. Its death throes were violent, and in its final moments, the fish tore into the lifeboat's tubes, puncturing them. The raft's buoyancy was compromised. Panic set in as water seeped in. Callahan had to repair the raft, but doing so meant plunging his arms into shark-infested waters. The predators returned, sensing his vulnerability. Fear turned to rage. Callahan lashed out at the ocean, screaming into the emptiness. Yet deep inside, he knew rage wouldn't save him. He improvised. Using a plastic fork from a Boy Scout mess kit, he patched the raft as best he could. Exhausted, he collapsed into restless sleep. When he awoke, the patch held. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself a sliver of hope. By the 76th day, Callahan was barely human. He was skeletal, hallucinating visions of the dead beckoning him into the deep. His last cans of water were gone. His body was failing. Then, as if the universe had finally relented, a miracle appeared. On the horizon, a fishing vessel emerged, drawn by the seabirds circling above his lifeboat. The birds had been scavenging the ecosystem Callahan's lifeboat had created, their presence a silent beacon for the fishermen. As the boat approached, Callahan lay limp, too weak to even wave. The men aboard gasped at the sight of him, a hollow-eyed ghost of a man who had cheated death. Callahan's rescue was nothing short of miraculous. By the time he was pulled aboard, he had lost a third of his body weight. It took weeks before he could walk again. Yet, in his own words, he bore no regrets. The stars, he once said, were like heaven seen from a seat in hell. The ocean had broken him, but it had also transformed him. Stephen Callahan's 76 days adrift remain a testament to human endurance, but his tale is more than one of survival. It is a haunting reminder of the ocean's indifference, a force that can offer beauty and death in the same breath. The ocean was eerily calm that night, its vast expanse cloaked in darkness. Beneath the surface, something ancient stirred, something hungry. For the men of the USS Indianapolis, there would be no warning, no escape. Their fate was sealed before they even realized the ocean had turned against them. It began on July 30th, 1945. The USS Indianapolis, a Portland-class heavy cruiser of the United States Navy, had just completed a mission of unimaginable importance. Carrying parts for the world's first deployable atomic bomb, the ship had raced to the island of Tinian at record-breaking speed. Its crew felt the pride of a mission accomplished, yet they were unaware that death lurked just beneath the waves. As the cruiser sailed toward Leyte for training, disaster struck. Just after midnight, the Indianapolis was spotted by a Japanese submarine. Alone, without escort, and lacking sonar capabilities, the ship was a vulnerable target. At exactly 12:15 a.m., 2 Type 95 torpedoes ripped through its side with thunderous force. The impact was catastrophic. Flames erupted, metal screamed as it twisted apart, and men were hurled into the ocean like ragdolls. Within just 12 minutes, the USS Indianapolis was gone, swallowed by the Pacific. Over 300 men went down with her, leaving nearly 900 survivors adrift in a sea that would soon become their graveyard. At first, the men clung to hope. Surely, they thought, rescue would come within hours. But unknown to them, their SOS signals had been ignored. The Navy had lost track of their ship, and the commanders who might have acted dismissed the calls as false alarms, or worse, traps. For the sailors floating in the open ocean, the nightmare was only beginning. When dawn broke, they saw it, the glint of dorsal fins slicing through the water. The sharks had arrived. Drawn by the chaos of the sinking and the scent of blood, dozens, perhaps hundreds, of oceanic whitetips and tiger sharks began circling the survivors. At first, the predators feasted on the dead, their massive bodies thrashing as they tore into the lifeless flesh. But soon, the corpses were gone. The sharks turned their attention to the living. The attacks were relentless and unpredictable. A man would be talking one moment, his voice trembling with fear, only to be dragged screaming into the depths the next. Survivors watched helplessly as their comrades disappeared beneath the waves, the water around them stained crimson. Each attack eroded their sanity, leaving them hollow-eyed and trembling. Some men tried to fight back, thrashing and screaming to ward off the predators. But the frantic movements only attracted more sharks, mimicking the death throes of wounded prey. Others succumbed to despair, their bodies giving out under the unrelenting sun by day and the bone-chilling cold by night. By the third day, madness took hold. Men began to hallucinate, seeing rescue ships that weren't there or claiming they could hear planes overhead. One sailor swore he saw the Indianapolis just below the surface, its mess hall stocked with fresh water. He dove repeatedly, inviting others to join him, but the water he drank was the salty ocean. He died shortly after, his body convulsing from the poison. On the fourth day, salvation finally came, but only for a few. A Navy seaplane happened to spot the survivors, its crew horrified by the sight of hundreds of men clinging to life amidst a sea of sharks. They signaled for rescue, and after what felt like an eternity, help arrived. Out of nearly 1,200 crew members, only 317 survived. For those who lived, the ordeal left scars that would never heal. But the horror didn't end there. Captain Charles McVeigh, commander of the Indianapolis, was court-martialed for failing to evade the torpedo attack. Though even the Japanese submarine captain testified that nothing could have saved the ship. Cleared of some charges but burdened by guilt, McVeigh spent the rest of his life haunted by the loss of his men. In 1968, unable to escape the ghosts of the past, McVeigh ended his life on his front lawn with the Navy-issued revolver he had carried since his service began. The story of the USS Indianapolis is not just a tale of war. It is a story of unimaginable suffering, of men consumed by the merciless sea and the predators within it. And even decades later, the silent screams of those lost beneath the waves still echo, a haunting reminder of how the ocean never forgets. The distress call crackled over the static-filled airwaves, sending chills down the spines of the radio operators who intercepted it. All officers are dead, including the captain, lying in chart room and bridge, possibly the whole crew dead. I die. The message, fragmented and haunting, was accompanied by eerie, indecipherable Morse code, then silence. It was 1948, and the tropical waters of Southeast Asia's Malacca Strait, an essential artery for global shipping, had suddenly become the stage for one of the most baffling and horrifying maritime mysteries in history. The strait itself, a narrow stretch of water squeezed between the Malay Peninsula and the Indonesian island of Sumatra, has long been a place of legend and danger. Yet no pirate tale or storm story could prepare the world for the nightmare about to unfold aboard the Dutch freighter SS Orang Medan. When the American merchant vessel Silver Star intercepted the distress signal, its crew knew they had to investigate. Setting a course toward the ship's last known coordinates, they found themselves sailing into an enigma drenched in blood and fear. The Silver Star spotted the Orang Medan hours later, its silhouette ghostly against the horizon. The ship floated lifelessly, eerily still, as if time itself had abandoned it. No movement, no sound, just an unnatural calm that sent shivers through the rescue crew. Hailing the ship yielded no response. With growing unease, the captain of the Silver Star ordered a boarding party. What they found would haunt their memories forever. As the sailors climbed aboard, an icy chill greeted them. This alone was bizarre, given the tropical heat exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The deck was a charnel house. Lifeless bodies of the crew lay scattered, their faces frozen in expressions of sheer terror. Their limbs were grotesquely contorted, as if they had died trying to fend off some invisible assailant. Even the ship's dog hadn't escaped the horror. Its lifeless form, jaws locked in a final snarl, bore the same inexplicable expression of fear. In the captain's quarters, the master of the ship lay face down in a pool of blood and gore. His eyes stared blankly at nothing, wide with unimaginable terror. On the bridge, the officers and engineers were similarly mangled, their shredded uniforms the only clue to their identities. And then there was the radio operator, the one who had sent the chilling SOS. He remained seated at his station, his fingers still gripping the transmitter. His eyes, like all the others, were wide open, unblinking, and filled with a horror that death had failed to erase. The deeper the boarding party ventured, the more unsettling the scene became. The ship seemed unnaturally cold, despite the blazing sun outside, and while the bodies were undeniably fresh, they were decaying at an alarming rate, as though some unnatural force was accelerating the process. What struck the rescuers most was the absence of visible injuries on most of the crew. Aside from the bridge officers, who appeared to have been savagely torn apart, the others bore no wounds at all. It was as if they had simply dropped dead, their souls ripped from their bodies by an unseen force. The Orang Medan itself showed no signs of external damage. There was no evidence of piracy, no indication of a mutiny or struggle, and yet something had killed every soul aboard. As the rescuers completed their grim inspection, the Silver Star's captain made the decision to tow the Orang Medan back to port. But the ship had one final horror in store. As the Silver Star's crew secured tow lines, smoke began to billow from below decks. Panic ensued as they scrambled to sever the ropes. Moments later, the Orang Medan erupted in a massive explosion, the blast so powerful it lifted the ship out of the water before it sank into the depths of the Malacca Strait. The chilling mystery of the Orang Medan was now sealed beneath the waves. The story of the Orang Medan has been told and retold, each version adding to its mystique. Official records of the ship's existence are scarce, and some argue it never sailed at all. Skeptics point out that the Silver Star itself was operating under a different name during the time of the incident. Yet believers insist the ship was real. Its name derived from the Indonesian city of Medan in Sumatra. They speculate that its deadly cargo, possibly chemical or biological weapons left over from World War II, may have been the cause of the tragedy. One theory links the Orang Medan to Unit 731, a secret Japanese military facility notorious for its inhumane experiments. After the war, the theory goes, deadly biological agents were smuggled out of Asia aboard civilian vessels to avoid detection. A catastrophic leak aboard the Orang Medan could explain the sudden deaths and the eerie lack of external injuries. Whether the Orang Medan was a victim of human folly, supernatural forces, or some combination of the two, the truth remains elusive. To this day, the story of the ghost ship lingers in the shadowy corners of maritime lore, a haunting reminder of the perils that lie beneath the surface of the sea. Perhaps it is better that we never uncover the full truth. After all, some mysteries are best left to the depths. The sand beneath his feet was soft, warm, a stark contrast to the cold, relentless ocean. The water lapped gently at his ankles, soothing his soreness after a grueling morning of soccer. But when 16-year-old Sam Kazan stepped out of the shallows of Brighton Beach that Saturday, something was wrong. His feet felt strange, tingling like 1,000 tiny needles piercing his skin. When he looked down, his breath caught in his throat. Blood. Bright, vivid, and unstoppable, it trickled down his legs and pooled on the golden sand beneath him. Panicked, Sam rushed back into the ocean, desperate to let the salt water cleanse his wounds. But even as the waves washed over his feet, the bleeding wouldn't stop. The more he looked, the more it became clear. This wasn't just a cut or scrape. His legs were covered in tiny pinprick-sized wounds, too many to count. His father wasted no time. Within minutes, they were racing toward Dandenong Hospital. Sam sat in the waiting room, his legs wrapped in a towel that quickly soaked through with blood. It wasn't long before the floor beneath him was dotted with crimson. Nurses and doctors exchanged puzzled glances, their confusion growing with every passing minute. Specialists were called in, toxicologists, marine biologists, but no one could explain the strange, relentless bleeding. The wounds were small, like something had nipped at his flesh, but the damage was catastrophic. Finally, someone whispered a name, sea lice. At first it sounded absurd. Sea lice were tiny, shrimp-like parasites that fed on fish, not people. They were barely visible to the naked eye and harmless in small numbers. But Sam's injuries told a different story. Something far more sinister had happened in those waters. Sam's father, determined to uncover the truth, returned to the beach with a net and raw slices of beef. He submerged the bait in the same waters where his son had waded hours earlier. When he pulled the net back up, his stomach turned. The meat was swarming with hundreds, no, thousands of tiny creatures. They weren't just feeding on the flesh. They were draining it of blood, leaving behind nothing but pale, shredded tissue. He filmed the gruesome discovery and rushed back to the hospital. Marine experts reviewed the footage in stunned silence. These weren't ordinary sea lice. They were something far more aggressive. Adult sea lice, particularly the females, can become ravenous under certain conditions. Once they latch onto a source of protein, they feed with relentless hunger, consuming tissue, mucus, and even blood. Dr. Walker Smith, a marine biologist, reviewed the case. "It's impossible," he muttered, his voice tinged with disbelief. "These creatures aren't predators. They don't swarm like piranhas." But the evidence was undeniable. Sam had disturbed a feeding frenzy, a rare and horrifying event. His injuries were so severe that even seasoned experts were left shaken. Jeff Weir, the executive director of the Australian Dolphin Research Institute, recounted his own experience. While diving beneath a nearby pier, he had surfaced to find blood streaming from his cheeks and forehead. Even so, he admitted that Sam's encounter was the worst he'd ever seen. "They're vital to the ecosystem," one expert explained, trying to downplay the horror, like scavengers of the sea. But for this to happen, he must have been there far longer than he realized. Sam's story didn't just terrify the locals of Brighton. Thousands of miles away in Virginia Beach, swimmers reported similar encounters. Tiny bites, relentless itching, and rashes that lasted for days sent terrified beachgoers running from the water. Some even ended up in local hospitals, convinced they were infected with a mysterious disease. Experts in Virginia were quick to clarify. In their case, the culprits weren't sea lice but blue crab larvae, tiny creatures that looked like alien lobsters with pincers sharp enough to irritate human skin. While not dangerous, their swarming behavior was enough to keep people out of the water. But Sam's case was different. His encounter highlighted a chilling truth. The ocean, vast and mysterious, holds secrets we may never fully understand. Beneath its surface lurk creatures and phenomena that defy explanation. For Sam, the scars eventually healed. But the memory of that day, of feeling his flesh nibbled away by a swarm of unseen predators, remains. And as he stands on the shore now, looking out at the tranquil waves, he knows one thing for certain. We are strangers in the ocean's world, and sometimes the ocean reminds us. It was around midnight on a chilly Saturday night in March when I made a decision that I would regret for a long time. I had just left a friend's place in San Diego after a long, exhausting day. The drive home to Riverside was a 2-hour stretch of mostly empty highway, something I had done countless times before. But that night, it felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, a thick, almost suffocating stillness that settled over the road like a fog. It wasn't a physical fog, but a kind of unnatural quiet, the kind that makes your skin prickle and the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. As I started my drive, I tried to shake off the feeling. How bad could it be? A simple drive, just a couple of hours. I had done it before, and surely I'd do it again. I set the car's cruise control and let the hum of the engine and the occasional whir of passing trucks lull me into a false sense of calm. The faint sound of classic rock on the radio kept me company, but something felt off. The radio seemed distant, almost as though the music was coming from another world entirely. It didn't help that the further I drove, the darker the night seemed to grow. By the time I was about 30 minutes out, the city lights had faded behind me, leaving only the bleak, desolate highway stretching out before me. My GPS was acting strange. It kept flashing red, rerouting me, insisting I take an exit that wasn't on my usual route. I brushed it off at first, assuming it was just a glitch. But soon the words "recalculate" flashed across the screen and I realized something wasn't right. Maybe there was an accident ahead, or construction. The thought of a detour was less than ideal, but it seemed harmless enough. I took the exit. Immediately everything shifted. The road narrowed and the thick trees on either side closed in like sentinels, their dark, looming shapes merging with the night. The headlights of my car barely pierced the darkness, illuminating just enough of the road to keep me from veering off into the trees. I was alone out here, truly alone. No other cars, no signs of life, just me, the road, and the vast, oppressive silence that seemed to swallow everything. The sense of unease crept in slowly, like ice water creeping up my spine. The road twisted ahead, winding through dense woods with sharp, unpredictable turns. It was as if the road itself was conspiring against me, pulling me deeper into the darkness. And then my gas gauge, already hovering near empty, warned me it was even lower than I thought. Panic settled in. There was no sign of another car, no sign of civilization, just miles of endless trees and shadow. I had to keep going. There had to be something ahead. Anything. Then, just when I thought I might drive off the edge of the earth, I saw it. A faint glow, almost as if the darkness itself was cracking open. A small, run-down gas station sat in the distance, a beacon in the night. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. It looked like the kind of place that had been frozen in time, a relic of a bygone era, the faded fluorescent lights flickering overhead. The cracked pavement and the sign, half-missing letters, gave the place a haunted, abandoned feel. Still, I was desperate, and I pulled up to the pump. No other cars. No life. Not a sound except for the hum of the lights. I stepped out of the car, the cold air biting into my skin, and walked toward the pump. Only then did I notice the oddity. The pump was one of the old models, the ones where you had to prepay inside. Of course, I muttered under my breath, irritated at my own forgetfulness. I pushed the door open and the squeak of the hinges seemed unnaturally loud in the eerie silence. As soon as I entered, the musty air hit me, thick with the scent of old wood and stale cigarette smoke. Behind the counter, an old man sat, staring blankly ahead, his face half obscured by shadows from the flickering light above him. His presence was unsettling. There was something about his eyes that seemed to follow me, though he didn't move, didn't speak. I walked up to the counter and handed him a $20 bill for the gas. He took it without a word, his gaze lingering a fraction too long on my face. My stomach tightened. I forced myself to look away, trying to shake the feeling that something was wrong. I turned quickly, eager to leave. But as I grabbed the pump and started filling up, I couldn't help but glance back at the store. The old man was still there, standing motionless behind the counter, his eyes fixed on me through the window, his face partly obscured by the shadows. Something about that gaze sent a jolt of cold fear straight through me. I finished pumping the gas as quickly as I could and got back in my car, slamming the door behind me. The engine roared to life, but the eerie silence still clung to the air. I didn't look back as I pulled out of the station. It felt like I was being followed, watched by unseen eyes. Every turn, every shadow in my periphery seemed to whisper my name. The road ahead stretched endlessly, the dark trees pressing in around me, suffocating in their silence. Then my headlights caught something in the road. At first I thought it was an animal, but as I got closer, I realized it was just an old tire. The sight startled me, and I swerved slightly to avoid it. My heart hammered in my chest. I glanced in my rearview mirror. There was no one behind me. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, trying to calm my nerves. But then, the headlights appeared. At first, I thought it was just another car, maybe a late-night traveler on the same lonely road. But as I checked my mirror again, I realized something was off. The car was still behind me, but it wasn't moving any faster, wasn't gaining any ground. It just stayed there, perfectly aligned with my rear view. I sped up. The car behind me matched my pace. My hands gripped the wheel, my palms clammy, my pulse quickening. There was something wrong with this. The road was too narrow to pull over, so I kept driving, trying to keep my cool. But the car kept its distance, staying just close enough to be unsettling, just far enough to make me doubt my senses. And then, I caught a glimpse of it. A beat-up sedan. The paint was chipped, the body faded and rusted. The driver's seat was empty, or at least that's what it looked like. The headlights burned bright, almost too bright, illuminating everything in their path. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't see the driver's face. It was obscured by shadows, by the darkness, as if they were trying to hide themselves. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That this wasn't just some random person driving down the road. The car was waiting, watching. I didn't know what to do, so I did the only thing that made sense in that moment. I veered off onto a dirt road. The gravel crunched beneath my tires as I accelerated, bouncing over rocks and potholes, trying to lose them to escape whatever strange pursuit this was. My heart was in my throat, my breath shallow. The sound of the engine was drowned out by the thumping of my pulse in my ears. I finally came to a stop, my car hidden in the blackness of the road. The engine died, and for a moment I thought I might have lost them. I waited. I held my breath, and then, just as I was about to breathe a sigh of relief, I saw the glow of headlights cutting through the darkness. The sedan had found the dirt road. I slouched down in my seat, barely breathing, my heart in my mouth. The car crept forward, slow, deliberate. The headlights bathed everything in their harsh light, but the driver, whoever they were, remained hidden in the shadows. They passed by. The seconds felt like hours. I waited, holding my breath, not daring to move, not daring to make a sound. After what felt like an eternity, I saw the sedan's lights fade into the distance. The road was empty. The silence returned, but this time it felt even deeper, more oppressive. I started my car and drove again, not looking back. The road ahead was empty, and yet the unease didn't leave me. It followed me like a shadow, hanging over me, a constant reminder that something had been watching, waiting. When I finally reached home, the first light of dawn was beginning to creep over the horizon. The sun, still hidden behind the trees, painted the sky with a faint, eerie glow. I sat in my car for a long time, my hands still shaking, my mind racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone, or something, had been right there with me, trailing me through the dark. I never saw that car again, but every time I drive at night, every time the darkness seems to stretch on forever, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched, that something is out there, waiting. It was the fall of last year when I experienced something so bizarre that even now I struggle to explain it. I had just finished a grueling business trip in upstate New York, 3 days packed with back-to-back meetings and endless stress. By the time my final meeting wrapped up, it was already late, and I was desperate to get home. I had a long drive ahead of me, but I figured I could power through it. After all, it was just a few hours on the road, and I had done it countless times before. The evening was crisp and cool, with a thick fog rolling in, settling over the quiet roads like a blanket. It was the perfect weather for a solitary drive through the winding backcountry roads. I left around 8 p.m., and about an hour into my journey, I realized just how hungry I was. I hadn't eaten much that day, and the fog was thickening, making it hard to see even a few feet in front of me. I knew I needed a break before continuing, so I started scanning the roads for a place to stop. That's when I saw it. A small diner, barely visible through the fog. Its neon open sign flickered dimly, casting a pale glow that barely cut through the mist. I pulled into the parking lot, noticing an old rusted sedan parked at an odd angle near the entrance. The place looked run down, like it hadn't been updated in decades, but the warm light from the inside felt oddly inviting. I figured a quiet meal would be the perfect way to shake off the stress of the day. As I stepped inside, the bell above the door jingled softly, and I immediately felt uneasy. The diner was nearly empty, except for one man sitting at the counter. He was older, his face hidden in shadow as he sipped from a coffee mug and stared straight ahead, his posture stiff and unmoving. He didn't acknowledge my presence, but I could feel his eyes on me, like he was sizing me up. The waitress, a woman with a strange, distant air, gave me a polite nod, silently motioning for me to choose a seat. I opted for a booth near the window, glancing out at the thick fog swallowing up the parking lot. The diner was eerily quiet, with only the faint hum of the jukebox playing an old jazz tune I didn't recognize. It felt soothing, yet oddly unsettling, as if time itself had paused in this forgotten place. The waitress came over and handed me a menu, flashing a warm smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She seemed distant, almost as if she weren't really there at all. I ordered a coffee and a burger, and she nodded, jotting it down without a word, then disappeared into the back. As I waited, an uncomfortable stillness filled the air. The diner felt frozen in time. Old advertisements, faded Coca-Cola posters, and an ancient smoking section sign adorned the walls, though there wasn't a soul smoking. The man at the counter hadn't moved a muscle, his eyes never leaving the dimly lit space in front of him. And the waitress? She vanished into the back again, leaving me completely alone in the main dining area. I tried to shake the growing unease, but it clung to me like the fog outside. After a few minutes, she returned with my coffee, setting it down with a slight smile before retreating back to the counter. I took a sip, the warmth offering a brief comfort, but the silence gnawed at me. It was too quiet. The kind of quiet that felt heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. Soon my burger arrived. I dug in, trying to push away the mounting tension that crawled up my spine. But just as I was halfway through my meal, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I glanced up and saw that the man at the counter was now staring directly at me. His eyes were cold, unblinking, almost as if he could see straight through me. He spoke then, his voice low and gravelly, the words slicing through the silence like a knife. "Not many folks stop here anymore," he said, his voice carrying a strange weight. "Yeah," I replied, trying to force a smile, "just heading home." He gave a slow, deliberate nod, still watching me with that chilling, unreadable expression. Then his lips curled into a small, unsettling smirk. "This road's got a bit of a reputation. People see things here." My stomach churned, but I couldn't help myself. "Like what?" I asked, curiosity edging into my voice despite the unease growing inside me. He chuckled, a low, unsettling sound that seemed to echo too long in the silence. "People go missing. They say they see things they can't explain. If I were you, I'd get back on the road before it gets too late." I forced out a nervous laugh, trying to play it off. "Thanks for the advice, but I think I'll be fine." He didn't respond, just kept staring at me, his eyes never leaving mine. The waitress shot me a quick, almost imperceptible glance as if warning me to leave, but said nothing. I quickly finished my meal, paid the bill, and nodded to the waitress as I stood to leave, eager to get away from the unnerving atmosphere. When I stepped outside, the fog was even thicker than before, swallowing up the diner's warm glow, leaving only an eerie haze. I glanced back, half expecting to see the man watching me from the window, but when I looked, there was nothing, just an empty, dimly lit diner. It was as if the place had consumed all the light, all the life, leaving nothing behind but an oppressive emptiness. I got into my car and started the engine, eager to put as much distance between myself and that unsettling place as possible. But as I pulled away, I noticed something strange. The diner. It was gone. I glanced in my rearview mirror, but there was no sign of it. No faint glow, no outline of the building, nothing. Just an empty stretch of foggy road. My heart raced and I sped up, trying to shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. The fog continued to thicken, clinging to the road like a nightmare, and the air felt heavy, dreamlike, surreal. I pressed on, but then I saw something in my rearview mirror. Headlights. Bright, glaring headlights, following me. I couldn't tell if it was the man from the diner or just my mind playing tricks, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The headlights stayed with me, their glare unwavering, no matter how fast I drove. I could feel the presence behind me, like something dark, something waiting. The lights stayed for miles, following me until suddenly they faded into the fog, leaving me alone once again. I didn't feel any better. If anything, I felt worse, the feeling of being hunted gnawing at me. When I finally reached home, my hands were still shaking. I immediately searched online, hoping to find some record of the diner, a name, anything to prove it was real. But there was nothing. No mention of a diner on that stretch of road. No mention of a strange man, or an eerie waitress. It was as if the place never existed at all, like it had been a figment of my imagination. But I know what I saw. I've driven that same route several times since, hoping to catch a glimpse of the diner. But it's never been there again. To this day, I still can't explain what happened. But one thing's for sure, there are places where reality bends, where the rules of the world don't quite apply. And sometimes, the things we encounter on lonely, foggy roads don't stay behind us. They follow us, waiting for the right moment to reappear. It was around 11:30 p.m. when I finally left the coffee shop where I worked part-time as a barista in a small town in Nevada. The late-night shifts always dragged on, but tonight had been particularly long. I had stayed later than usual to help close up, and now, exhausted but with a heavy heart, I knew I had about an hour's drive ahead of me, mostly desolate stretches of highway with no signs of life for miles. I wasn't looking forward to it, but I didn't want to crash on the employee couch. That old, stained relic of a couch hadn't seen comfort in decades. The thought of spending another minute in that dingy coffee shop was unbearable. I shrugged on my coat, grabbed my thermos of coffee, and braced myself for the drive. The streets were eerily quiet as I pulled onto the highway. The headlights cut through the dark, casting long shadows against the barren desert landscape. The first half hour of the drive was uneventful. The radio played soft country tunes, and the dim glow of the dashboard lights illuminated the dark cabin, casting a comforting glow. There's an odd peace you only get when driving alone in the dead of night. The kind of peace where the world outside feels like it's holding its breath. But that peace was short-lived. About halfway through my drive, I saw something up ahead. Just a shadow at first, standing motionless by the side of the road. My headlights barely caught the figure, but it was enough to make me slow down. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe just a trick of the light. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a trick. It was a woman. Her face was obscured by long dark hair, but her posture was unnerving, arms lifted, hand waving in a frantic, almost desperate motion. What in the world? Who would be standing out here on a deserted highway at midnight? My gut instinct told me to keep driving, to avoid getting involved. But as I passed, I took one more glance in the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it. She hadn't turned to watch me drive away. Her gaze was locked forward, still waving her arm, unmoving. It felt wrong, as if she were frozen in time, or worse, waiting. My heart rate quickened, but I forced myself to shake it off. People did strange things late at night. I couldn't afford to overthink it. But that unsettling feeling lingered. Minutes later, the check engine light flickered on. I cursed under my breath, eyes darting to the dashboard. The gas gauge was dangerously low, even though I had filled up earlier. I blamed it on my car's quirks. Maybe the fuel line was acting up again. Still, I could feel the anxiety clawing at me. I was in the middle of nowhere, with no cell service and no help for miles. If my car broke down, I would be stuck here until morning. Suddenly, the headlights of another car appeared in my rearview mirror, and relief washed over me. Maybe they could help if something went wrong. I kept driving, but the car behind me started gaining on me at an alarming speed. I squinted through the windshield, struggling to make out the shape of the vehicle. The headlights were blinding, forcing me to squint, but it was clear the car wasn't just speeding. It was right on my tail, too fast. Before I could react, the car swerved into the other lane, pulling up alongside me. I tried to glance over, hoping to make eye contact, maybe get a signal for help, but the windows were dark, completely black. There was nothing inside the car, no driver, no passengers, just empty darkness. The car stayed beside me for a few seconds, matching my speed. I could hear the hum of its engine as it silently glided next to mine. My pulse pounded in my throat as I gripped the steering wheel. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the car swerved back in front of me, cutting me off. It slowed down to a crawl, the brake lights glowing in the dark, forcing me to slow down with it. I had no choice but to follow. The car's presence was suffocating. My heart hammered in my chest. Why were they doing this? It felt like some twisted game. I had no idea who was in that car or what they wanted, but I could feel their gaze through the darkened windows, watching me. After what felt like an eternity, the car sped up again and disappeared into the night. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding, trying to calm my frayed nerves. But just as I thought I was safe, I saw something else up ahead. The woman. The same woman. She was standing in the middle of the road now, her arm raised in that same unnatural wave, her face still obscured by long dark hair. Panic surged through me. I slammed on the brakes, the car coming to a screeching halt just a few feet from her. My pulse roared in my ears. She didn't move. She didn't flinch. She just stood there, staring straight ahead, her hand held high in that eerie, impossible wave. Every rational instinct told me to drive away, but I couldn't move. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out of there, but my body refused to obey. She was too still, too unnatural, and then, without a word, her arm slowly lowered and she started walking, gliding, toward the side of the road, vanishing into the darkness. I didn't wait for her to fully disappear. As soon as I saw a clear path, I floored the gas pedal, speeding down the highway as fast as I could. No way was I stopping for anyone again. Not tonight, not ever. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see her there, standing in the middle of the road watching me. But there was nothing. Only the winding stretch of dark highway behind me. The rest of the drive was a blur. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had happened. Was she real? Was it some kind of prank? A hallucination from exhaustion, or maybe something worse? When I finally pulled into the gas station on the edge of town, I was shaking so badly that I could barely get out of the car. The fluorescent lights and the hum of the pumps were a lifeline, anchoring me back to reality. I filled up the tank, paid inside, and left without saying a word to the clerk. But even after all that, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong, the eerie sense of being watched, the sensation that I wasn't alone. I never saw the woman again, nor the strange car that had followed me. I told myself it was just a bad night, that it was nothing. But every time I drive that stretch of highway now, the unease creeps back. The sound of an engine in the distance makes my heart skip a beat. The shadows seem a little deeper, the road a little lonelier. And sometimes, just sometimes, when I glance in my rearview mirror, I think I catch a glimpse of something. A shadow, a figure standing there, watching. A chill runs down my spine, and I can't help but wonder if I'm being followed by something far worse than the darkness. Something waiting for me to stop again. If you enjoyed stepping into the darkness with me, just remember this. There's a price to driving alone in the dead of night. A price that not everyone can pay. Some things follow you. Some things never let you go. This happened 20 years ago, but even now, the memory crawls back into my mind like a cold, uninvited whisper in the dark. I was a pizza delivery driver back then, working late nights to scrape by. It was Friday, a football night. The town was alive with cheers and drunken laughter, and I'd made a decent haul in tips that evening. The last call of the night came in just as I was about to wrap up. A large order out to a run-down house at the edge of town, a place I'd always avoided if I could. Something about it felt off. The windows were perpetually dark, and the air around it seemed heavier than it should have been, like it was holding its breath. Still, duty called, and I figured it would be a quick stop. The clock was ticking, and the faster I got there, the sooner I could call it a night. When I arrived, the porch light flickered faintly, barely illuminating the group of people waiting outside. There were about 12 of them, all in various states of disarray. Their eyes were glazed, their movements erratic. The unmistakable stench of alcohol and something sharper, almost chemical, hung heavy in the air. I handed over the pizza, but before I could leave, one of them spoke up, a wiry guy with hollow cheeks and a menacing grin. "You're late," he said, his voice slurring slightly. I glanced at my watch. No, I'm not. The order was right on time. He stepped closer, his smile widening unnaturally. If it's late, it's free. That's the rule, isn't it? Before I could respond, the others began closing in around me. Their posture was threatening, their eyes glinting with something darker than just mischief. I was alone, outnumbered, and the energy around them felt dangerous, predatory. Reluctantly, I handed over the pizza, hoping it would be enough to pacify them. I started backing toward my car, my heartbeat thundering in my chest. Just as I reached the driver's side door, one of them called out, "Hold up!" For a moment I thought they were going to tip me. I don't know why. Maybe it was naivety, or maybe I just wanted to believe the night could end without incident. But as I turned, the wiry guy lunged, slamming me against the car. Chaos erupted. Someone wrenched open the passenger door and grabbed the cash I'd stashed there. Another figure loomed behind me, and I felt the cold press of a knife against my throat. "Don't move," a voice hissed in my ear, low and venomous. Time seemed to fracture. I remember the blade glinting under the flickering porch light, the feeling of their hands rifling through my pockets. Then, nothing. The next thing I knew, I was in my car, the engine roaring. My hands were trembling on the wheel, my breath ragged. As I reversed, I saw a girl standing directly behind my car, her face eerily calm, her eyes locked on mine as though daring me to run her down. I was so angry, so shaken that I aimed for her. My tires screeched, and she jumped out of the way at the last second. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. Later, I learned how it all ended. The police caught them easily. They hadn't even bothered to leave the house. Turns out, they were wanted for a slew of other crimes. The guy who held the knife to my throat got a couple of years, as did the one who stole my money. The others? I don't remember what happened to them, and honestly, I don't care. I moved across the country a few months later, desperate to leave that chapter of my life behind. But sometimes the memory resurfaces, vivid and unrelenting. I attended the trial of the man with the knife. He looked different, older, less menacing. I've even checked his social media since then. By all appearances, he's turned his life around, but that doesn't erase the terror he etched into my soul. It took 2 years to get my money back, but no amount of time can erase the image of that knife glinting in the dim light, or the girl standing behind my car like a shadow given form. Even now, when I drive past dark, flickering porches, I feel the same dread creep into my chest. That house may have been just another rundown place, but to me, it will always be the House of Shadows, a place where the air was thick with malice and my life dangled by a thread. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't gotten into my car. What would they have done if I hadn't escaped? I was delivering pizzas for a local chain. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. I'd been doing it long enough to know the dangers. Drunk customers, occasional robberies, the rare creep who stared a little too long. But nothing prepared me for what was coming. It happened several years ago in a small, quiet town where nothing truly sinister ever seemed to occur. That was until the whispers began. They started with news of a girl who had vanished under chillingly suspicious circumstances. Her name was Emily, a bright, lively college student whose sudden disappearance sent ripples of unease through the tight-knit community. Billboards went up overnight, her face plastered on every corner. Local and state authorities, even federal investigators, descended upon the town, turning it into a hotbed of anxiety and speculation. But no one could have imagined the darkness that lay just a few blocks from where I worked. A month after Emily's disappearance, the news broke. An arrest had been made, and the suspect was someone they were certain had committed the crime. The name rang in my head like a bell. When I saw his photo, my stomach churned. I knew that face. I knew that address. The man's name was Peter Aldridge. He lived in a grimy apartment complex just a few blocks down the road from the pizza shop. I'd delivered there not too long ago. The place was notorious among us delivery drivers. A sprawling maze of crumbling buildings with locked doors, sketchy tenants, and an eerie silence that made your skin crawl. That day, I couldn't shake the memory of my encounter with him. Peter had ordered late in the evening, a large pepperoni pizza, the kind of order that always felt like a setup. When I arrived at the complex, I followed my usual rule. No buzzing in, no going to the unit door. Too many drunk college kids had made me wary of those long, dimly lit hallways. Peter didn't like my rule. He buzzed me and demanded I come up, saying he couldn't leave his unit. His voice was cold, with an undertone of irritation that sent a shiver down my spine. "I can't come down. Just buzz in. I'm on the 3rd floor," he insisted. "Company policy doesn't allow that," I lied, my voice firm. I wasn't going into that building. There was a pause. Then in a sharper tone he said, "I'll be right there." When he emerged from the shadows of the lobby, his appearance unsettled me. Peter was pale, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce right through you. His movements were deliberate, almost predatory. He handed me the cash with a clenched jaw, his displeasure evident. I didn't stick around. I bolted for my car, my heart pounding. It wasn't until that day, reading the article, that the true weight of what happened hit me. Peter Aldridge wasn't just a creep. He was the monster responsible for Emily's disappearance. What's worse, the details of his crime were grotesque. Emily's body had been found hidden in the crawl space beneath his unit. Evidence suggested he had lured her in with fake promises, then kept her captive for days before finally ending her life. I couldn't stop replaying the moment when Peter tried to coax me into his building. If I'd gone inside, would I have ended up like Emily? The thought made my skin crawl. What I didn't tell anyone, what still haunts me to this day, was the feeling I'd had when Peter handed me the cash. It wasn't just the way he looked at me, cold and calculating. It was the faintest streak of red on his sleeve. At the time, I'd dismissed it. Maybe he'd cut himself, I thought. Maybe it was nothing. But now I know better. The police searched Peter's apartment thoroughly after his arrest. The things they found were unspeakable. A notebook filled with crude drawings of girls. A locked trunk containing strands of hair. And worst of all, a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards where he had kept souvenirs from his victims. To this day, I can't deliver to that complex. Every time I drive past, I feel like the walls are watching me. I wonder how many more shadows lurk within, waiting for their moment to strike. Peter Aldridge is in prison now, but his presence still lingers, like a ghost tethered to the scene of his crimes. I'll never forget the moment I stood face to face with a predator, and I'll always be grateful for the gut instinct that kept me outside that building. But sometimes, late at night, I hear his voice echoing in my mind. Buzz in. I'm on the 3rd floor. And I wonder, if I hadn't said no, would I still be here to tell this story? It's one of those relentless nights, the kind where time blurs and the world feels like it's conspiring against you. Nick, an exhausted pizza delivery guy, had been rushing non-stop for hours, racing through the relentless summer heat. The air felt like a thick, suffocating blanket, wrapping around him, making every breath feel heavier. His uniform clung to his skin, soaked with sweat, but he didn't have the luxury of stopping. He had orders to fulfill, and the clock was ticking. There was no time for breaks, not even to relieve himself, and now his bladder was rebelling violently. Every few minutes his eyes darted to the clock on his dashboard. Only 3 more deliveries, he muttered to himself. Then I can go home, take a long shower, and collapse into bed. But as he sped toward his next delivery, a gnawing discomfort in his lower abdomen grew steadily more unbearable. The address was familiar. He'd delivered to that house several times before. But tonight something felt off. The neighborhood, usually bustling with the hum of students and late-night parties, was unnervingly still. It was summer, so most of the students were gone. But there was always some sort of life, even at this hour. Tonight, however, the silence pressed down on him like a heavy weight. The house came into view, its dark silhouette outlined by the dim glow of the street lamps. The flickering lights created strange shadows that danced across the lawn, making the place look abandoned. Nick frowned, slowing his car as he rolled past the empty driveway. Something felt wrong. No lights flickered from the windows, not even the faint glow of a TV or lamp. It was as if the house itself had exhaled a deep, silent sigh, and now it lay in a deathly hush. Worse, the street lamp closest to the property was out, casting a sinister shadow over the area. The soft hum of the world around him seemed muffled, as if the very air was holding its breath. Why does it feel so wrong tonight? Nick muttered under his breath, glancing nervously at the empty street. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, a creeping sensation settling in his bones. He pulled the car to a stop at the curb, staring at the darkened house. His foot tapped restlessly on the brake pedal, eyes darting back and forth across the street, but there was no sign of movement, no indication that anyone was home. And yet, the delivery had been placed. Someone had ordered the pizza. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he jumped slightly, startled by the sudden sound. When he glanced at the screen, he saw the customer's number calling him. "Hello?" Nick answered, his voice tired, yet laced with confusion. "Yeah?" A breathless voice rasped through the line. The voice was strained, hurried, and there was a nervous edge to it. "I'm outside, but it doesn't look like anyone's home," Nick said, his own unease beginning to seep into his words. "There's no lights, no sounds. I'm not sure if—" "I'm so sorry," the voice interrupted. "I lost track of time at work. I'll be there in just a couple of minutes." Please don't leave. I'll be there in 5 minutes, tops." The voice sounded young, maybe mid-20s, and genuinely distressed. Despite his growing discomfort, Nick decided to wait. He'd had odd deliveries before, customers who were running late or preoccupied, but nothing like this. He hung up the phone, glancing nervously at the empty street again. The oppressive stillness of the night seemed to press in on him, and the air felt unnaturally thick. The urge to relieve himself, however, was now too strong to ignore. He quickly looked around for a secluded spot. A cluster of bushes near the front yard of the dark house caught his eye. They were tall enough to offer some cover, and with the street lamp malfunctioning, he'd be invisible from any passing cars or pedestrians. His bladder screamed in protest as he unzipped and hurried over to the bushes. The relief was instant, sweet, soothing relief. But just as the pressure lifted, a strange sensation hit him. The sound. It wasn't right. It wasn't the soft rustling of leaves that should have met his ears. It was something solid, something too thick. Before he could process what was happening, the air around him seemed to darken, and a guttural voice snarled from behind him, "What the hell?" Nick's heart stopped. He froze, mid-action, as a shadowy figure erupted from the bushes. The man was tall, towering over Nick, cloaked in a dark, hooded jacket that barely moved with him, as if he was part of the shadows themselves. His movements were quick, violent. He barreled past Nick, spitting curses under his breath as he stumbled away, muttering to himself, eyes wild. In the dim light of the street lamp, Nick caught a glimpse of something horrifying. A twisted, contorted face in the darkness, and a pair of eyes that glinted with menace. But it wasn't just the man's unsettling appearance that froze Nick to the spot. No. It was the chill that ran down his spine as he saw, in the man's wake, something left behind. A discarded drawstring bag lying in the bushes. Despite every instinct screaming at him to run, Nick's trembling hands reached for the bag, driven by some primal curiosity. His fingers fumbled with the strings, pulling them open. Inside, his heart sank as he laid eyes on what was there. A sharp, gleaming hunting knife, blood-stained and rusted at the edges. A roll of duct tape, and a small yellowing bottle of pills. Something illicit, something dangerous. Panic surged through him, a cold rush of adrenaline that almost made him stagger. He quickly shoved the bag back into the bushes and backed away, his breathing coming in ragged gasps. The man had been more than just hiding. He had been waiting for something or someone. Nick's heart was thumping in his chest as he stumbled back toward his car. His legs were shaking so violently that it felt like they might give way beneath him at any moment. As he slid into the driver's seat, he slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling hands. His eyes were wide, his gaze darting back toward the house, half expecting the man to emerge from the shadows. Without a second thought, he slammed the car into gear and sped away, tires screeching against the pavement as the engine roared to life. He didn't stop, didn't look back, until the house was a distant memory behind him. The memory of the man's eyes, filled with malice, still haunted him as his grip tightened on the steering wheel. His phone buzzed again, this time with a call from the customer. Nick's heart skipped a beat. He hesitated, torn between the overwhelming urge to flee and the possibility that the woman was walking straight into danger. The chilling image of the knife, the tape, and the pills flashed in his mind. What if she's walking into a trap, he thought, the tension building in his chest. Ignoring the call, he dialed 911, his hands shaking as he recounted the events. His voice was frantic, each word rushing out in a panicked blur. "There's a guy in the bushes. He had a knife and duct tape. He's stalking someone. I think he was waiting for her. She just called me. She's almost there. You have to stop her." The dispatcher tried to calm him, her voice slow and deliberate, but it was no use. Nick's thoughts were a whirlpool of fear. His mind raced, but it couldn't focus on anything but the image of the man's wild eyes, his cruel intentions. Then his phone buzzed again, another text from the customer. I'm here, where are you? Nick's breath caught in his throat. There was no time to wait for the police, no time for caution. He turned the car around, fear squeezing his chest. Please let me be in time. His hands trembled as he gripped the wheel, his knuckles white. When he arrived, he spotted her, petite, dressed in a loose hoodie, standing under the broken street lamp, glancing around, confused. Her eyes flicked from side to side, searching for the delivery car. She didn't notice the danger that was so close, that was practically breathing down her neck. Nick slammed on the brakes, his car screeching to a halt. His headlights flashed across her face, and she startled, taking a step back in surprise. His heart pounded as he threw open the door. "Get in the car, now!" he hissed, his voice trembling with urgency. The woman hesitated, eyes wide with confusion. "What? Why? Is something wrong? There's no time." "A man was hiding in your bushes with a knife. I've already called the police. Please just get in." Fear flickered across her face, but without another word she climbed into the car. Nick slammed the door shut behind her, his hands shaking as he started the engine. He drove quickly, but carefully, toward a safe location the dispatcher had suggested, where they could wait for the police. The woman didn't speak for a long time. Nick glanced at her from time to time, but her eyes were fixed on the window, her face pale, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Finally, her voice broke the silence. I know who it was," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He's been following me for weeks." Nick's stomach churned. The feeling of dread he had experienced earlier now seemed like a premonition, a warning he hadn't heeded. As they arrived at the safe location, sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Nick took one final glance at the rearview mirror, still haunted by the face of the man. Who was he, Nick thought, and why had he targeted her? But before he could dwell on it any longer, a figure emerged from the shadows. A police officer approached, her face stern, eyes focused on Nick. And then, just as quickly as they had arrived, the sounds of sirens filled the air. The nightmare was only beginning. The sound of a scream echoed through the dark tunnel, slicing through the air like a blade. It wasn't the kind of scream you'd expect at Disneyland, the joyful, excited kind that comes with the thrill of a roller coaster. This was different. This was raw terror, soaked in panic and pain. I grew up a military brat in San Diego, California. My dad, a Marine Corps gunnery sergeant, spent 25 years serving his country. He was my hero, but growing up with him was anything but easy. He was strict, rarely home, and when he was, discipline took precedence over play. Despite that, his firm hand kept me grounded, and his absence made me value family even more. But nothing could prepare me for the time he was deployed to Iraq in 2003. I was just 11 years old, and every day without him felt like an eternity of worry. Each news report on TV turned my stomach, and every mention of fallen soldiers made my heart race with dread. By September, the anxiety was unbearable. My mom, noticing how badly it was affecting me, decided we needed a distraction. She took me to Disneyland for the weekend, hoping to ease my mind. At first, it worked. The bright colors, the characters, the rides. It all felt like stepping into another world. For a while, I forgot about the war, my dad, and all the stress at home. That is, until we got in line for Big Thunder Mountain Railroad. It was late, close to 11:30 p.m., when we climbed into the little rail cars. The ride started off like any other, fast twists, sudden drops, and thrilling turns. But as we approached the fake desert landscape and ascended into a pitch-black tunnel, something went horribly wrong. The car jolted violently, throwing us against the sides of our seats. A metallic grinding screeched through the darkness, followed by a deafening thud. Then came the screams, piercing, desperate, and far too real. For a few moments, everything was still. The ride had come to a complete stop, and an eerie silence settled over us, broken only by the faint whimpering of frightened riders. I could feel my mum's hand gripping mine, her knuckles cold and tense. Then a woman's voice rang out, trembling and filled with anguish. Mark, wake up, please, wake up." As my eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the cracks in the tunnel, I saw it. Several of the cars ahead of us were off the tracks, mangled and crushed. The one at the very front had derailed entirely, its rear end slamming into the car behind it. Blood gleamed on the twisted metal, pooling onto the floor. My stomach churned as I realized the truth. Someone hadn't made it. Chaos erupted. People scrambled to climb out of the cars, shouting for help and urging others to get out. My mum and I followed, shakily making our way down the narrow path alongside the tracks. As we passed the derailed cars, I caught a glimpse of the damage. The front car was completely destroyed, and the passengers inside were trapped. Some motionless, others crying out for help. The woman who had been screaming for Mark was still there, clutching a lifeless body in her arms. Her voice cracked with desperation, her cries echoing through the tunnel. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. The image burned itself into my mind, a horrifying reminder of how fragile life can be, even in a place meant for joy. We were eventually led out by park staff to a makeshift medical station near the River Bell Terrace. My mom and I were shaken but unharmed. Others weren't so lucky. Some had serious injuries, and one man, Mark, had died from the impact. The aftermath was surreal. Disneyland, a place of magic and happiness, now felt haunted. The cheerful music playing faintly in the background only added to the eerie atmosphere. I couldn't stop replaying the events in my head, the scream, the blood, the crushed cars. Even now, years later, the sound of roller coasters or the sight of theme parks fills me with unease. I've never stepped foot on a roller coaster since that day. For me, the thrill isn't worth the risk. That ride on Big Thunder Mountain changed something in me. A reminder that even in the happiest places, darkness can strike without warning. And the worst part? I still hear her voice sometimes, late at night as I lie in bed. "Mark, wake up. Please wake up." It's a sound I'll never forget. It was a crisp February morning in 1999, the kind that begins with a veil of mist clinging to the horizon, casting an eerie stillness over the sprawling grounds of Disney World in Orlando, Florida. As the first rays of sunlight kissed the castle spires, the park still slumbered, its rides silent, its pathways empty. Yet, beneath the surface of this manufactured paradise, an unimaginable nightmare was about to unfold. I worked as a custodian, a fancy Disney term for janitor. My days were a mix of mopping floors, emptying trash bins, and preparing the park for its daily wave of visitors. Occasionally, I'd help guests navigate the park, answer their endless questions, and try to smooth over complaints about things I couldn't control, like the weather. It wasn't glamorous, but the camaraderie among the staff made it bearable. We were like family, bonded by our shared experiences. That morning, I was assigned to Tomorrowland, strolling toward my tasks with a slight hangover from the previous night's outing. As I passed the Fantasyland Skyway platform, I spotted Ray, a cheerful older custodian who had been with us for about a year. He was up on the platform, sweeping diligently, whistling a tune that carried through the crisp air. "Morning, Ray," I called up to him. He paused, waved, and returned my greeting with a warm smile before resuming his work. It was a simple moment. One of those fleeting interactions you never realize will haunt you forever. As I walked away, the gentle hum of the park was broken by a sound that made my stomach knot, a mechanical whirring. The Skyway gondolas were coming to life, gliding along their suspended cables. My steps faltered. Something wasn't right. Ray was still up there. Panic set in as I turned and sprinted back toward the platform. The gondolas were moving too fast and Ray hadn't noticed. He was still sweeping, his back to the oncoming danger. "Ray, look out!" I screamed, my voice cracking with urgency. He turned, his expression shifting from confusion to horror as the gondolas bore down on him. He tried to move, but it was too late. The gondola struck him, sending him staggering backward. What happened next felt unreal, like a scene from a slow-motion nightmare. Ray grabbed onto the edge of the gondola, his knuckles white as he clung for dear life. He dangled there, 60 feet above the ground, his legs kicking desperately. "Hang on, Ray!" I shouted, my voice trembling with helplessness. He tried to pull himself up, but his strength was failing. The gondola continued its relentless journey, carrying him away from the platform and over the park. Beneath him, the hard concrete stretched like a death trap. Then I saw it, a patch of flower beds beneath the gondola's path. It wasn't much, but it was better than the unyielding concrete. "Jump, Ray, jump to the flowers," I yelled, praying he could hear me over the mechanical hum. For a moment he hesitated, glancing down at the ground below. Then, whether by choice or by exhaustion, his grip faltered. He fell. The world seemed to hold its breath as Ray plummeted, his body twisting in the air before he crashed into the flower beds with a sickening thud. I reached him within seconds, my heart pounding as I dropped to my knees beside him. Ray was alive, but barely. He lay motionless, his breaths ragged and labored. Blood bubbled from his lips, staining his chin. His eyes, once so full of life, were glazed with pain. "I'll get help, Ray. Just hold on," I choked out, tears streaming down my face. I sprinted to find another cast member, frantically shouting for them to call 911. Paramedics arrived within minutes, loading Ray onto a stretcher and rushing him to the hospital. We all clung to hope, convincing ourselves that the flower beds had saved him, that he would pull through. But hope can be cruel. Later that day, the news came. Despite the doctor's best efforts, Ray had succumbed to his injuries. The fall had caused catastrophic internal damage. He was gone. The loss hit us like a tidal wave. Ray wasn't just a co-worker, he was family. His death left a void that nothing could fill. A memorial was placed backstage in his honor, a tribute to a man who had brought so much light to our lives. Even now, I can't shake the memory of that day. The sound of his whistling still haunts me, a ghostly echo that lingers in the quiet moments. And when I close my eyes, I see his face, his fear, his pain, and the heartbreaking finality of his fall. Rest in peace, Ray. You deserved so much more. The air was thick with a simmering Florida heat, but it wasn't the warmth that sent a chill through me. It was the sound, a girl's desperate, muffled scream that pierced through the laughter and joy of Disney World's Animal Kingdom. That scream, raw and haunting, signaled that something was terribly, dreadfully wrong. Let me take you back. In 1998, my family and I traveled across the Atlantic for what was supposed to be the most magical trip of our lives. For a 10-year-old kid from the UK, Disney World was nothing short of a paradise. The colors were brighter, the trees more fantastical, and everything, every ride, every character, felt like a dream come to life. But dreams have a way of curdling into nightmares when you least expect it. The day began like any other in the park. I was buzzing with excitement, clutching a soda cup bigger than my head, thrilled to explore the animal kingdom. Everything seemed perfect, until I noticed her. She was about my age, maybe a year or two younger, with wide, tired eyes and a face that wore misery like a mask. She clung to the hand of a man who I assumed was her father, but something about them felt off. While the rest of the kids radiated joy, she seemed crushed under an invisible weight. Her dad, or so I thought, kept a firm grip on her wrist, his knuckles white with tension. At first I brushed it off. Not every kid could be as over the moon as I was, right? Maybe she was having a bad day. But as we meandered through the park, I kept seeing them, on the safari tour near the cafes, and later in the crowd by the lion exhibit. Each time the girl's demeanor hadn't changed. If anything, her sadness seemed to deepen, her movements more reluctant, as if she wanted to be anywhere else but by his side. It wasn't until I saw the man's hand tighten around her arm, jerking her when she lagged behind, that I felt the first prickle of unease. "Behave," he hissed, his tone sharp enough to cut through the chatter around us. Her face twisted in silent fear, but she said nothing. Not yet. The breaking point came near a shaded pathway. She pulled away from him for just a moment, and his grip hardened like iron. The girl began to cry, her voice trembling as she wailed, "I want my mommy. Where's my mommy?" The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My dad's face, usually calm, turned pale as he exchanged a look with my mom. Nearby, people were starting to take notice. Whispers rippled through the crowd as the man leaned down, his voice low but menacing. "Quiet down," he snapped. "We'll get you to mommy soon." But then she said it. The words that froze everyone in their tracks. "You're not my daddy." The atmosphere shifted instantly. The murmur of conversation ceased. replaced by a suffocating silence. Adults around us exchanged uncertain glances, unsure of how to proceed. Then someone, a burly man in a baseball cap, stepped forward. "Hey, buddy, is everything okay here?" The man holding the girl stammered, his grip tightening. "She's just having a tantrum," he insisted, his tone forced and brittle. But the girl's trembling voice cut through his excuses. "He took me! He's not my dad!" Chaos erupted. Parkgoers surged toward them as the man's facade crumbled. He tried to drag her away, but the crowd wouldn't let him. Someone grabbed his arm while others formed a protective circle around the girl. She was sobbing uncontrollably now, her cries muffled as the man clamped his hand over her mouth. I remember my mum pulling me and my sister away, shielding us from the escalating scene. But I couldn't look away. I saw the man's face twist in rage, veins bulging as he realized he had lost. Park security arrived moments later, pinning him to the ground as he thrashed and shouted obscenities. The little girl, her tiny body shaking with sobs, was whisked away by a kind-looking woman who had pushed through the crowd to comfort her. I didn't understand the gravity of what I had witnessed until years later, when my parents finally explained it to me. That man wasn't her father. He had lured her away, promising her the magic of Disney World, and had sinister plans for her once the illusion wore off. To this day, I can't forget the sound of her scream or the look in her eyes as she pleaded for help. Disney World is often called the happiest place on earth, but for one terrifying moment, it became something far darker. If she hadn't spoken up, if people hadn't intervened, I shudder to think what could have happened. That nightmare could have ended very differently. But because of her courage and the actions of strangers, she was saved. Still, the memory lingers, a haunting reminder that even in the brightest places, shadows can lurk, waiting to strike. The humid Florida air clung to me as I stared out the motel window, heart pounding, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There he was, Mickey Mouse, standing under the flickering streetlight by the highway. His oversized ears, filthy costume, and lifeless black eyes were unmistakable. But this wasn't the Mickey my kids adored. This was something darker, something wrong. How did he find us? It all started a few days ago when my wife and I took our kids to Disney World. It was meant to be the perfect family vacation, a chance for the kids to finally experience the magic of the park, and for us adults to soak up the tropical vibe. But what should have been a week of laughter and sunshine quickly spiraled into something I still struggle to explain. That day in downtown Orlando was hot and bright, the kind of weather that made me regret my Cuban sandwich binge. My wife had ducked into a restroom, leaving me to corral our kids. I found a bench, plopped down, and told them to stay close while I closed my eyes for just a moment. When I opened them, my heart sank. My son was halfway down the street, standing next to someone dressed as Mickey Mouse. At first, I felt relieved that he hadn't wandered off completely. But as I approached, something about the costume struck me as wrong. It wasn't just the cheap material or the obvious knockoff design. It was filthy, stained with grime and God knows what else. The person inside the suit didn't move with the exaggerated cheerfulness I'd seen at the parks. Instead, Mickey stood eerily still, staring at my kids with those vacant black eyes. "Hey, buddy," I said, pulling a $20 bill from my wallet, hoping to defuse the situation. "Thanks for entertaining the kids." The head of the suit tilted, the gesture sharp and mechanical, sending a shiver down my spine. He didn't speak or even move to take the money. Those lifeless eyes just stared. "All right, kids," I said, forcing a laugh. "Time to go find Mom." But Mickey reached out, his oversized glove brushing my son's arm. My instincts kicked in and I stepped between them, my voice firm. "Don't touch my kids." He didn't respond, didn't flinch, just kept staring. Grabbing my children by the hands, I pulled them away, ignoring their protests about wanting to stay with Mickey. As we walked off, I glanced over my shoulder. Mickey was still there, motionless, watching us. That night, I couldn't sleep. The motel's air conditioner had chosen the worst possible time to break down, and the oppressive heat only added to my unease. I got up, poured myself a glass of ice water, and sat at the kitchenette table, trying to shake the unsettling encounter. Something drew me to the window. Pulling the blinds aside, I peered out into the darkness and froze. Standing by the highway, illuminated by the pale orange glow of a streetlight, was Mickey. My blood ran cold. How did he know where we were staying? Was he following us? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe it wasn't even the same guy. But deep down, I knew. It was him. Grabbing a knife from the kitchenette, I crept back to the window. Mickey was gone. No, not gone. Closer. Lying in the parking lot just a few feet from our room was the filthy costume. Empty. Panic surged through me. My eyes darted around, searching for the man who had been inside, and then bang! His bare face slammed against the window, his wild eyes staring directly into mine. I stumbled back, heart racing as I shouted for my wife to lock herself and the kids in the other room. The man outside was naked, his body pale and gaunt. He pounded on the glass with fists, head, anything he could, desperate to get in. I waved the knife at him, yelling that the cops were on their way. The mention of the police seemed to reach him. He paused, then shifted his focus to the door, ramming his shoulder against it with alarming force. The minutes felt like hours until the distant wail of sirens broke the tension. The man stopped, his head snapping toward the sound. In an instant, he vanished into the shadows, taking the tattered Mickey suit with him. When the police arrived, I gave them everything I could. Details about the encounter, the costume, the man's disturbing behavior, but they didn't find him. We flew back to Maine the next day, leaving the nightmare behind. Or so I thought. To this day, I don't know how he found us or what he wanted, but every now and then, I'll catch a glimpse of something, a shadow lingering too long, a figure watching from the corner of my eye, and I'll wonder, is he still out there, waiting, watching? Imagine a place so idyllic, so meticulously designed that it feels like stepping into a storybook. White picket fences, pastel-painted houses, and streets that seem to hum with an artificial cheer. A town where autumn leaves are shipped in to flutter on the breeze, and Christmas feels magical under fake snow, even in the sweltering Florida heat. But beneath this polished veneer lies something sinister, a town whose secrets seep like poison into its perfect streets. This is Celebration, Florida. The illusion shattered violently in 2010 when the quiet streets were rocked by the brutal murder of 58-year-old teacher Matteo Giovandito. Living alone with his chihuahua, Matteo was found dismembered in his own home, his body parts scattered as if to mock the tranquility Celebration once symbolized. David Israel Mourinho, a homeless drifter, confessed to the crime, claiming he acted in self-defense after Matteo allegedly assaulted him. But as investigators delved deeper, a darker truth surfaced. Former students of Giovandito revealed chilling accounts of years of abuse, claims of being touched, manipulated, and betrayed by a man their parents trusted. Just days after Giovandito's grisly death, his neighbor Craig Fushi barricaded himself inside his house and opened fire on police. A tense 12-hour standoff ended when officers stormed the home, only to find Fushi dead by his own hand. Whispers suggested he, too, was implicated in the town's darkest secrets. Not far from Celebration's picturesque streets lies a body of water known to locals as the Death Pond. On the surface, it appears serene, reflecting Florida's azure skies, but its depths tell a different story. In 1998, 3 young men visiting Florida vanished without a trace. 9 months later, their car was found submerged in the pond, their bodies decomposed beyond recognition. The same waters claimed the life of a 2-year-old boy, snatched by an alligator as he played near the edge. No signs warned of the danger, no barriers kept the unwary from straying too close. The pond became a grim symbol of Celebration's hidden dangers, proof that even in a manufactured paradise, chaos reigns supreme. Celebration's problems weren't limited to violence and tragedy. Rumors swirled of an underground culture of infidelity and wife-swapping. Residents spoke of Celebration separation, a nickname for the epidemic of divorces among those who had moved there hoping for a fresh start. Malcolm Longley, a property investor, described it as an incestuous town, where escapism turned to hedonism. For many, the town's promise of perfection proved too suffocating, its utopia nothing more than a gilded cage. In 2004, Disney quietly sold Celebration to a New York-based company, distancing itself from the increasingly notorious town. Since then, attempts to reclaim its image have felt hollow. Residents and marketing executives have tried to rebrand it as a true community, a place where families can thrive. But for those who know its history, Celebration is forever tainted, a paradise lost, consumed by the very darkness it sought to escape. Behind its pristine facade lies a chilling truth. No amount of manufactured joy can hide the ugliness of human nature. In Celebration, even the happiest dreams can turn into nightmares.
It began with a subtle unease, a gnawing sensation that someone was always watching. If I'd known what was coming, I would have trusted that feeling. But hindsight, they say, is always cruelly clear. Craigslist had always been a convenience for me. A tool to sell furniture, electronics, or clothes and snag a good deal here and there. As a woman, I stayed cautious. I'd heard my share of horror stories about sketchy buyers and eerie encounters, but my experiences had been mundane at worst. A few weird buyers had made me uneasy, but nothing that lingered. Until now. One night, while aimlessly browsing Craigslist, I stumbled across the Missed Connections page, a mix of humor and human desperation. People posted about fleeting encounters, hoping their message would reach the stranger who'd caught their eye. It was amusing, if not a little voyeuristic. But that evening, one post wiped the smile off my face. The title was simple. Hello, the message read, "You should really pay more attention when people are watching you. It can hurt someone's feelings when they're ignored. You're blonde and petite, and I like watching you pick out your groceries." My stomach twisted as I reread the words. I was blonde, petite, and yes, I'd been grocery shopping the day before. Could it be about me? I tried to brush it off. Surely this was coincidence. There were plenty of blondes in my town. To shake off the chill, I kept scrolling, distracting myself with funny posts until I logged off. But that message lingered, a quiet itch in the back of my mind. A week later, life went on as usual. The unsettling post was just a memory buried under the routine of work and errands. One afternoon, I returned to my usual grocery store armed with a list and a goal to get in and out as quickly as possible. I wandered through the aisles, absent-mindedly tossing items into my cart. The store wasn't busy, and I paid little attention to the people around me. Then it happened, a prickling at the back of my neck like eyes boring into me. I glanced up, and there he was. A man stood at the far end of the aisle, his gaze locked onto me. He was short, overweight, and middle-aged, with features partially obscured by a mask. Yet his stare was unmistakable. Cold, penetrating, and chillingly deliberate. I looked away quickly, my pulse quickening. Maybe he wasn't looking at me, but when I chanced another glance, he hadn't moved. His eyes hadn't wavered. A wave of nausea hit me. I grabbed the remaining items from my list without thinking, my only focus on leaving as quickly as possible. At the checkout, I avoided looking back, fearing I'd see him again. When I finally stepped into the parking lot, relief was short-lived. I caught sight of him, trailing me from a distance. My pace quickened, heart pounding as I fumbled with my keys. He slowed as I reached my car, standing still, watching. I drove off with shaking hands, his image seared into my memory. That night, my unease turned to dread. Browsing Craigslist again, I couldn't resist checking the Missed Connections page. A new post caught my eye. "Nice seeing you." The message read, "I love watching you in the grocery store, but it was really rude of you to run away from me in the parking lot. I just want you to love me." The room spun as I reread the words. My suspicions were confirmed. The man in the grocery store had written this. He'd been watching me, following me, and now he was leaving a digital trail. Terror gave way to anger. Against my better judgment, I replied to the post, "Leave me alone, I'm calling the police." The response came almost immediately. "I was waiting for you to reply. It's so good to finally talk to you. Now we can be together." My stomach churned. I fired back a warning, demanding he stop contacting me and flag the post, but deep down, I knew this wouldn't end here. That night, sleep eluded me. Around 2 a.m., my phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from him. My hands trembled as I opened it. Attached was a photo of me in my kitchen. My blood ran cold. The clothes I wore in the photo were the same ones I had on at that very moment. He was outside. Before I could process the horror, there was a knock at the living room window. A voice followed, muffled but unmistakable. "Let me in. We can finally be together." My instincts took over. I bolted into the bathroom, locking the door behind me. My hands shook as I dialed 911. The operator's calm voice tried to steady my frantic breathing, but then I heard it, the sound of glass shattering downstairs. The operator's voice urged me to stay on the line, but panic consumed me. My house, my sanctuary, was no longer safe. I pressed my ear to the bathroom door, straining to hear his movements. Footsteps echoed on the stairs. Each creak was a countdown to him finding me. Tears streamed down my face as I prayed the police would arrive in time. Then came the pounding. He was at the bathroom door, slamming against it with a force that made the hinges groan. "Open up," he bellowed. Just as I thought the door would give way, distant sirens pierced the night. The pounding stopped. I heard him retreat, his footsteps fading as the sound of police cars grew louder. When the officers arrived, the man was gone. They found broken glass and muddy footprints, but no sign of him. I recounted everything. The Craigslist posts, the grocery store, the photo. They promised to investigate, but I could see the unease in their eyes. For now I've moved to a new place, far from the haunting memories of that night, but the fear remains, creeping into the corners of my mind. Every time I hear a knock or catch a stranger's stare, my heart races. I've learned one thing: some connections are best left missed. It was the kind of quiet morning that made you feel like everything was just routine. The store was still dark when I arrived, the only sound being the occasional hum of the mall's ventilation system. As I unlocked the doors and flipped on the lights, a faint unease crept up my spine, but I brushed it off. After all, this was my first job, just a part-time gig to help pay for college. What could possibly go wrong in a busy mall surrounded by people? I was 18, fresh out of high school and eager to prove myself. I started the day like any other, tidying the shelves, turning on the register, and replying to overnight emails. Customers began trickling in as the morning wore on. It was business as usual, helping people find items, smiling politely and ringing up their purchases. Around midday, a man came in, looking slightly out of place. He was middle-aged, with a worn look about him, carrying a shopping list that seemed more like an afterthought. "Hi, can I help you find something?" I asked, keeping my tone bright and professional. His eyes lit up. "Yes, actually, I'm shopping for my daughter's birthday. Could you help me pick out a few things?" I nodded, walking him through the aisles. He asked a lot of questions, more than most customers, but I figured he was just one of those indecisive dads trying to do something nice for his kid. When we got to the register, he made a little joke about how his daughter would probably like the gift more if it came with a receipt for a refund. I laughed politely, handed him his bag, and thought nothing more of it. By the time my shift ended, the interaction was all but forgotten. I clocked out, headed to my college classes, and continued with my day. But a few days later, everything changed. I was out at a restaurant with my boyfriend, enjoying a rare moment of relaxation when my phone started buzzing. My work group chat had exploded with notifications. Curious, I opened the chat and saw a screenshot someone had posted. It was a Craigslist ad. The title read, "Missed Connection, the girl from the store." My stomach dropped. I opened the image, and there it was, a detailed description of me. Blonde, petite, friendly. The man described our encounter at the store down to the smallest details, like the color of my uniform and how I had smiled at him while scanning his items. He wrote about how polite I was, how he wished he'd had the courage to ask for my number, and how he hoped I'd see the post and contact him. I stared at the screen in disbelief, my boyfriend leaning over to read it as well. "Is this about you?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. I nodded slowly, my mind racing. I replayed that shift in my head, trying to remember anything unusual about the man. But nothing had seemed off at the time. He had blended in like any other customer. For the next few weeks, paranoia set in. Every time I worked, I felt like I was being watched. I stopped wearing my name tag, hoping to make myself less identifiable. I told my co-workers not to share my schedule with anyone, even if they seemed trustworthy. I started checking over my shoulder when I walked to my car after closing shifts. One afternoon, while I was restocking shelves, I thought I saw someone lingering near the store entrance. My heart skipped a beat, but when I looked again, they were gone. Later that day, a co-worker told me a man had been asking for me by name earlier, but she had told him I wasn't in. The feeling of being hunted was suffocating. The final straw came when another Craigslist post appeared. This time it was more direct. The man wrote that he'd been visiting the mall every day, hoping to run into me. He described watching me from a distance, admiring how I moved around the store. The thought of him lurking nearby made my skin crawl. I finally went to my manager and told her everything. She took it seriously, offering to adjust my schedule and have security walk me to my car. Still, the damage was done. My sense of safety was shattered, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was always one step behind me. To this day, I don't know if he ever stopped looking for me. I left that job not long after and made sure my next one had stricter security measures. I still think about how ordinary that day had seemed, how easy it was for someone to slip through the cracks of normalcy and turn something as mundane as a customer interaction into something sinister. Now, every time I step into a public place, I'm on edge, scanning faces, wondering if he's still out there, watching, waiting. The air was heavy that evening, like the world itself held its breath in anticipation. The pediatrician's office stood at the edge of a newly paved road, surrounded by an eerie silence. The quietness of the location, paired with the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights above the parking lot, gave the place an unsettling atmosphere. It felt like the kind of silence that carried secrets, ones you didn't want to uncover. I was a young mother, barely into my 30s, with 2 little ones depending on me. My life revolved around them, and their safety was always my priority. That day, I had driven my 1-year-old and 3-year-old to a routine checkup at the new pediatrician's office, located in an isolated part of Mont Georgia. The new building was pristine, the kind of place that looked safe at first glance, but carried an unexplainable unease. The parking lot was almost empty when we arrived, save for a few scattered cars. It was late afternoon, and the office staff had given us the last appointments of the day, knowing we lived an hour away. I stepped out of our black Jeep Cherokee and carried my kids inside, their laughter breaking the stillness for just a moment. The appointment went as expected, waiting, checkups, and small talk with the doctor. By the time we were done, the receptionist was locking the glass doors behind us, and the last of the other patients had already left. The once sparse parking lot was now completely deserted, with only my Jeep left. I strapped my kids into their car seats, settled into the driver's seat, and turned the key. Click, click, click. The car refused to start. At first I thought it was just a hiccup. "Come on," I muttered, trying again. But the engine didn't respond. My heart sank. We were alone in an empty parking lot, miles from home, and the sun was already dipping below the horizon. I stepped out, scanning the area as the receptionist waved goodbye and disappeared into her car. The silence that followed was suffocating. Left with no choice, I knocked on the locked glass doors until someone let me back inside. Using the office phone, I called a nearby garage. A man answered and assured me he'd come to help, though he might take a while. Reluctantly, I thanked him and returned to the car with my kids. We waited as the building's lights flickered off one by one. By the time the last employee left, night had begun to settle in. I tried to keep the kids entertained, feeding them snacks and digging through my bag for toys, all while watching the road for the mechanic's arrival. That's when I saw it. A truck pulling into the lot. Relief washed over me as a man stepped out. He was scruffy and middle-aged, with a friendly smile that immediately put me at ease. "You called for help?" he asked. "Yes, thank you so much for coming," I replied, explaining the issue. He nodded and popped the hood, poking around as I sat back in the driver's seat. I waited for him to ask me to try the ignition, but he didn't. Instead, he mumbled something about a loose wire and kept tinkering. "You might want to take a look at this," he said after a few minutes, motioning for me to join him. I hesitated. "I wouldn't know what I'm looking at," I said with a nervous laugh, choosing to stay with my kids. His smile faltered slightly, but he didn't press the issue. "Suit yourself," he muttered and went back to work. Minutes turned into what felt like hours. He called me over twice more, each time growing increasingly insistent. I stayed put, my unease growing with every passing moment. Something about the way he worked, slow, deliberate, didn't sit right. Why wasn't he using jumper cables? And why did he keep asking me to leave the car? Then, without warning, another truck roared into the parking lot. The man under my hood froze, his head snapped toward the new arrival, and in an instant he slammed my hood shut and bolted to his vehicle. I barely had time to register what was happening. His tires screeched as he sped away, leaving me stunned and alone once more. The new truck parked beside me, and a man stepped out, his face illuminated by the dim overhead lights. He looked at me, then at the fleeing truck, before approaching cautiously. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he asked, his voice steady and kind. "Yes, I think so," I stammered. "Are you the mechanic?" He nodded, confirming his name and mentioning the call I had made earlier. My breath caught in my throat as he gestured toward the road. "Who was that?" he asked. I thought it was you," I replied, my voice shaking. His expression darkened as he opened my hood and got to work, this time with the efficiency I'd expected from the start. Within minutes, the engine roared to life, and I felt a wave of relief. But then he paused, his hand holding something long and sharp. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and serious, "is this yours?" In his hand was a thin, dagger-like tool, almost 1.5 feet long. Its blade gleamed, and small round finger holes on one end gave it a sinister appearance. "No," I whispered, staring at the object. He studied it for a moment, then looked back at me, his face pale. "This was under your hood," he said slowly, "right on top, like someone had just placed it there." I felt a chill run down my spine. The tool looked old, but the blade was unnervingly sharp. "I don't know what was about to happen here," he added, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I'm really glad I showed up when I did." I nodded, unable to speak, and handed him the payment. He gave me one last warning. "You should call the police when you get home."
Not the kind you catch in the corner of your eye and dismiss, but one that lingers, watching, waiting. That eerie, gut-churning sensation of being observed crept into my life like an uninvited guest, and I didn't realize it until it was too late. I'm a junior in high school, living in a decent town. It's not a fancy private school kind of place, but it's good enough. My neighborhood? The kind people call up and coming, a polite way of saying it's okay but not perfect. I walk or bike everywhere since I don't have a car. I see a lot of people this way, and usually it's no big deal. Then, there was him. The first time I saw the man my friends and I would later dub the crackhead, I was heading to the park for some basketball. He passed by, muttering something incomprehensible. I ignored him. He was just another stranger on the street, or so I thought. One evening, my girlfriend and I were curled up on the couch, watching a movie. The cozy atmosphere shattered when a chill ran down my spine. Turning instinctively toward the windows behind the couch, I saw a figure standing there, peering through the blinds. The man's build and clothes looked familiar. My girlfriend turned to look, but by then he was gone, walking away as if nothing had happened. I convinced myself it was just a coincidence. A creepy one, sure, but nothing more. Until it wasn't. One day I was walking to the store with my best friend, P. The crackhead appeared again, approaching us with a friendly hello. We greeted him back and kept moving, but P's mood shifted. After a long pause, he turned to me, his voice low and uneasy. "You know he said your name, right? Did you tell him your name? I hadn't." My stomach sank. Then came the night that solidified my fear. P and another friend, Kay, were hanging out at my house. We decided to hit the park for a late-night basketball game. As we walked, we spotted him again, standing silently in the shadows. His eyes locked onto us, following our every move. We quickened our pace. He did too. Eventually he stopped, but the damage was done. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The final straw came early one morning. Unable to sleep, I went for a run at 5 a.m. Wrestling season demanded I stay fit, and I figured the crisp air might clear my head. As I rounded the corner onto my street, my heart nearly stopped. There he was, standing across from the entrance, staring at me. His eyes followed my every step. I turned onto my street, glancing back over my shoulder. He was gone. Vanished. By the time I got home, the sun was up, and I tried to convince myself it was just paranoia. But was it? Things only got darker. A few years later, when I was living alone in a small apartment, strange things began happening. Little things at first. Less food in the fridge than I remembered. Cushions from the couch on the floor. Misplaced items. It was unsettling, but nothing I couldn't explain away. Until one night. I woke up drenched in sweat, the air heavy with a suffocating silence. It was around 1 a.m., and I couldn't remember having a nightmare. I decided to take a shower to shake off the unease. As the steam filled the bathroom, I heard the faint creak of the door. My stomach twisted. I always left it slightly open, but it didn't move on its own. Grabbing my phone from the counter, I caught a reflection in the screen. Someone was standing on the other side of the shower curtain. My heart pounded, but I forced myself to stay calm. Slowly, I adjusted the water to its hottest setting. The pipes groaned as steam thickened around me. Then, with a surge of adrenaline, I spun around, ripped the curtain open, and aimed the scalding water at the intruder. It was a woman. She screamed as the water hit her, and in the chaos, I grabbed the shower head and struck her across the face. Bolting from the bathroom, I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it with trembling hands. Her fists pounded against the door as I called the police, but my fear turned to horror when I reached for a knife in the kitchen, only to find it missing. When the police arrived, they arrested her. The story they pieced together was chilling. She used to live in the apartment, but had been evicted for not paying rent. She'd made a copy of the key and had been sneaking in while I was at work, or worse, while I slept. To this day, I wonder if she was the reason I woke up that night. I've stopped trying to convince myself otherwise. Now, whenever I move, the locks are the first thing I change. Some shadows don't just pass by, they stay. And sometimes they know your name. It started with an angry growl, low and menacing, slicing through the stillness of the night. At first I thought it was just my dog, probably caught sight of a stray cat wandering too close to the house. But that night was different. The sound wasn't coming from the front window where he usually stood guard. No, this time, it was coming from the locked basement door. I'll get back to that night, but let me start at the beginning. When we first moved into that 3-story house, it felt like a dream come true. It was nestled on a quiet hill, the kind of neighborhood where people didn't bother locking their doors. My parents, my younger sibling, and our ever-watchful dog called it home for years. From the front, it looked like a modest 2-story house, but the basement opened out into the backyard, a backyard so spacious and quiet it felt like it belonged to another world. That's where we first met Lucas, the boy from across the street. At first glance, he seemed like any other neighborhood kid. Quiet, a little awkward, but harmless enough. It wasn't until much later that we realized there was something off about him. His behavior was unsettling, the kind that left a knot in your stomach without you knowing why. And now, thinking back, I'm almost certain Lucas had been inside our house. Our family wasn't great at keeping track of the basement doors. With all the comings and goings, letting the dog out, us kids running in and out to play, they'd often be left unlocked. Sure, my parents made it a nightly ritual to double-check the locks, but this was a neighborhood where everyone felt safe. No one worried about what might be lurking after dark. Until the growling started. It was around 2:30 a.m., and as usual, I was still awake in my upstairs bedroom. I had a messed up sleep schedule back then, spending hours scrolling or playing games, long after everyone else had gone to bed. That night, the growl pulled me out of my late-night haze. It wasn't a bark, it was low, guttural, primal. I rushed downstairs, expecting to find my dog by the front window, fixated on some animal outside. Instead, I found him at the basement door. His body was rigid, the fur along his back standing on end. His nose was pressed against the small gap at the bottom, as if he were trying to sniff out whatever was on the other side. My heart pounded. The door was locked, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was there. "Mom, Dad," I whispered urgently, shaking them awake. My dad groaned, waving it off as our dog reacting to noises outside. Eventually he got up to check, grumbling the whole way. When he came back, he looked tired but unconcerned. "Forgot to lock one of the basement doors," he said casually, as though that explained everything. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. A few weeks later, something even more terrifying happened. It was another late night, and I was in my room again when a sudden deafening bark echoed through the house. It startled me so badly I almost fell out of my chair. My dog rarely barked like that unless something was seriously wrong. I sprang up and glanced out my bedroom window, expecting to see an animal in the yard. Instead, I froze. There, running across our yard in the dark, was Lucas. His movements were quick and jerky, like he was trying to escape without being seen. He darted across the street and disappeared into his house. I stood there in stunned silence, my breath fogging the window. What was he doing in our yard at that hour? I yanked the curtains closed and sat down, shaking. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. The next morning, I told my mom everything. She promised to speak to Lucas's parents, but when she did, their response was maddening. Lucas? Oh no, he'd never do something like that. Their denial was firm, but I knew what I saw. I wasn't imagining things. Years later, when I look back on those nights, I can't help but wonder how far it went. Did Lucas ever make it past the basement door? Did he walk through our home while we slept, touching our things, standing over us? We don't live in that house anymore, and I've grown older, but the memories linger like a shadow in the back of my mind. And sometimes late at night when the world is quiet, I think I hear it again, that growl, that bark. And I wonder, was it ever just Lucas? Or was there something worse hiding in the dark? It started on a cold winter night. One of those nights when the world seems quieter than usual, like it's holding its breath. My little house in Northern California was nestled just outside the suburbs, surrounded by a perfect blend of solitude and distant neighbors. The darkness there had always felt comforting, until that night. As I pulled into my driveway, the headlights of my car cut through the heavy cloud cover, illuminating only the porch and a sliver of the yard. The air was sharp, and as I stepped out of the car, a strange, acrid smell hit me. Cigarette smoke. My heart sank. I had never noticed that smell here before. Scanning the shadows, I saw no one, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Brushing it off, I locked the door behind me and settled in for the evening. Exhausted from a long shift, I decided to take a quick shower and head to bed. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the water heater. By 7 p.m., I was under the covers, ready to surrender to sleep. But sleep didn't last. I woke suddenly, heart pounding, sure I'd heard something. a noise from downstairs. My first thought was my friend. He sometimes stopped by after work to use my shower, and I'd given him a spare key, but he always texted me first, and tonight there'd been no text. Reaching for my phone, the screen's blinding glow pierced the darkness, and I squinted to check the time. 9:12 p.m., no missed messages. My voice trembled as I called out his name. Silence. And then, footsteps. Loud, deliberate footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor below. My breath caught in my throat. Someone was inside my house. The footsteps quickened, heavy and frantic, moving toward the stairs. I sprang out of bed and darted to the closet. The intruder was already halfway up the stairs as I fumbled with the attic access. Adrenaline surged through me as I pulled myself up, barely managing to lift my feet inside before my bedroom door burst open. I froze. The footsteps stopped, replaced by the eerie creak of my closet door swinging open. Peering through the cracks in the attic floorboards, I could see him, just from the knees down. Dirty blue jeans, frayed cuffs, and worn work boots. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, his breathing heavy, the tension unbearable. Then a crash. The sound of my bed being flipped over shook the house. I bit down hard on my lip, trying to stay silent. He let out a guttural scream, full of frustration, before storming out of the room. I stayed curled in the attic, counting slowly, 1 second at a time. When I reached 1,000, I finally climbed down. My room was a disaster. My bed overturned, my belongings scattered everywhere. My phone was nowhere to be found, so I grabbed the landline and called the police. The first floor was in shambles. Chairs were knocked over, cupboards emptied, and shelves upended. The only thing missing was a knife from the wooden block in the kitchen. The police found evidence that the side door had been pried open with a crowbar. And then it hit me. He'd been outside when I got home, smoking in the shadows, watching me. They advised me to stay elsewhere, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. That night, I blocked the broken door with a heavy shelf and stayed awake, flashlight in hand, scanning the yard for any sign of movement. The next day, I had the door repaired and installed motion lights around the house. I even ran a phone line to the attic, unwilling to ever be stranded up there without a way to call for help. To this day, I can't stop thinking about what might have happened if I'd been slower, if he hadn't gone into the bathroom first, or if I hadn't made it to the attic in time. The darkness that once felt cozy now feels like it's always watching, waiting for a moment of weakness. That night changed everything, and I still don't know if he's out there, somewhere, waiting for another chance.
The evening air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and the faint rustle of leaves in the dense forest surrounding the village. Darkness crept in, not just from the descending night, but from the weight of the untold stories the land held. Stories whispered among elders, never spoken of openly. It was said that this village, abandoned by many during the war, carried a haunting secret. My wife and I had no idea then how deeply it would intertwine with our lives. When we moved to the old village in Laos, the government encouraged us to stay. Many had already fled during the war, seeking refuge in Thailand, but we chose to rebuild among the ruins. The villagers welcomed us with warmth, but not without a warning. Never walk alone at dawn or dusk. Their eyes darted to the shadows as they spoke of a pregnant corpse, a spectre that reeked of decay and roamed the outskirts of the village. The horror wasn't just in its sight, but in the suffocating stench that accompanied it. At first we dismissed the tales as mere superstition. Life in the village was quiet, albeit eerie. Many of the old houses were torn down, replaced with newer ones as more families trickled in. Still, the stories persisted. Those who had lived in the village before the war avoided certain topics, but reluctantly shared the chilling tale of the pregnant woman who had never found peace. Years before, during the chaos of the war, a man had lived in the village with 2 wives. When word spread that soldiers were coming to arrest Hmong men who had fought for the Americans, the man fled with his first wife and children. His second wife, heavily pregnant, was left behind. He promised to return for her, but the dense jungle and treacherous mountains made her journey impossible in her condition. Days turned into weeks, and the villagers occasionally saw her moving about the house. Then one day she disappeared. They found her lifeless body inside her home, her hands gripping her swollen belly as though trying to deliver her child alone in the night. Without a proper funeral, a crucial tradition among the Hmong, the villagers buried her hastily. It was after this that the sightings began. The villagers spoke in hushed tones about a pregnant figure with disheveled hair and a rotting stench that lingered long after she had gone. One warm evening, my wife and I decided to visit our son and daughter-in-law at their farm. Halfway there, we crossed paths with a couple returning from the fields. The man stopped us and spoke in a low, urgent tone. "Be cautious ahead. There's a smell, a rotting stench. We didn't notice it this morning, but now it's overwhelming. Be careful." My wife and I exchanged uneasy glances. The warning wasn't unfamiliar. It echoed the villagers' stories. We continued cautiously until the air grew thick with the unmistakable odor of decay. My wife froze and pointed to the edge of the forest. "There," she whispered, her voice trembling. Peering through the trees, I saw a figure lurking behind a banana tree. Its hair was matted, and it wore a green and red sash. My wife's grip tightened on my arm as she murmured, "It's her." I tried to pull her back, but she shook me off, handing me her bamboo bucket. "Stay here," she said firmly. "No man is allowed." "What are you doing?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. "She needs my help," my wife replied, her voice steady but distant as though in a trance. She walked toward the figure, calling out softly, "Daughter, let me help you." The figure turned and began to walk into the forest. My wife followed, her voice echoing through the trees. I wanted to go after her, but fear rooted me in place. Minutes turned into what felt like hours. A couple passing by noticed me standing there, pale and trembling. That night, under the dim glow of the oil lamp, she recounted what had transpired. The pregnant corpse had led her deep into the forest, to a cluster of bamboo trees. There it stopped and lay down, spreading its legs. My wife, driven by a strange compulsion, helped deliver the child. It wasn't a baby, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It was a mass of blood and hair, just clots, but it had form. She wrapped the remains in the green sash, handing it to the corpse. The figure cradled the bundle against its cheek before disappearing into the shadows. Since that night, the villagers reported no further sightings of the pregnant corpse. The oppressive stench that had plagued the area vanished. My wife, however, was never the same. She often spoke of the woman with pity rather than fear. She just wanted to finish what she couldn't in life, my wife would say. She wasn't evil, just a mother who wanted to rest. The village of La was no stranger to whispers of the supernatural, but no tale etched into its history was as bone-chilling as the story of Grandma Kia. It all began in her final days. The elderly woman, beloved by the villagers and affectionately called Grandma Kia, had grown frail and unwell. She spent most of her time in bed, her strength draining like water through a sieve. Yet as her body weakened, something far more sinister seemed to awaken within her. At night, eerie laughter echoed through her modest home. Her youngest son, who cared for her, would often find her staring at empty corners, murmuring incomprehensible words. Her once gentle gaze now seemed distant, her smile strangely unnerving. Whatever plagued her was more than illness. It was as if the boundary between life and death blurred before her passing. On her final day, Grandma Kia seemed to regain clarity. She wept openly for her youngest daughter, Pang, who had not visited her in years. "Don't bury me until Pang comes," she begged her son, her voice trembling with regret. She confessed an old grievance, a time when she had chased Pang and her husband with a stick, striking Pang's husband in a fit of anger. That incident, she believed, had kept her daughter away. Her love for Pang, though, had never wavered. At sunset, Grandma Kia breathed her last. The villagers dressed her in traditional funeral clothes and began the solemn rites. Messengers were sent to inform Pang, who lived in a distant village. The funeral stretched into 6 agonizing days and nights. The sweltering humidity accelerated the decomposition of Grandma Kia's body, and the air inside her home became unbearable. The villagers, exhausted and grieving, coped by using herbs in their cooking to mask the sickening stench. One dish stood out, a fiery papaya salad, spicy enough to scorch the tongue. It had been Grandma Kia's favorite in life. Pang entered the home, her heart pounding with guilt and sorrow, only to freeze in shock. The bamboo stretcher where her mother's body had lain was empty. "Where is my mother?" Pang demanded, her voice trembling. The elder overseeing the funeral awoke, startled. He turned toward the spot where Grandma Kia's body had been kept and gasped. The corpse was gone. Panic spread like wildfire. The villagers, already uneasy, scrambled to search for the missing body. They scoured every corner of the village and its outskirts. It was near the mango grove under the shade of a large tree where they found her. There sat Grandma Kia, hunched over a bowl of spicy papaya salad, eating with ravenous fervor. Blood and decomposing fluids dripped from her mouth, staining the ground beneath her. Her lifeless eyes stared ahead, yet her movements were unnervingly deliberate. "Who made this papaya salad?" she rasped, her voice a guttural echo of the woman she had once been. "Why is it so spicy?" Fear rooted everyone to the spot. The villagers whispered among themselves, unable to comprehend the horror before them. Grandma Kia was no longer the kind woman they had loved. She was something else, a grotesque mockery of life. As she continued to eat, Pang's husband, trembling but resolute, grabbed a sturdy stick. He approached her cautiously, the villagers holding their breath. With one swift motion, he struck her on the head, the sickening thud echoing in the grove. Grandma Kia slumped to the ground, lifeless once more. The villagers, shaken to their cores, wrapped her body carefully and returned it to the house. They resumed the funeral rites with a renewed urgency, performing every ritual with meticulous precision. By sunset, they carried her to the graveyard at the edge of the village and buried her beneath the earth. The village of La still speaks of Grandma Kia's haunting hunger. Some say it was her unresolved regret and longing for Pang that kept her tied to the mortal world. Others believe the spicy papaya salad, a dish she had adored in life, was the final link between her and the living. To this day, the mango grove is avoided after dark. Villagers swear they can still hear faint whispers and catch the scent of papaya salad on the breeze, a chilling reminder of the night Grandma Kia returned. They say some places are cursed, where even the earth refuses to let the dead rest. In a quiet, remote village, nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, a tale unfolded that no one would dare speak of in the light of day. It began with a young woman who had just given birth. Tradition dictated her diet, only chicken and rice for a month. But once her dietary restrictions lifted, she yearned for the taste of mushroom soup. Against whispered warnings of toxic mushrooms growing wild in the area, she satisfied her craving. Hours later, she was writhing in agony, her stomach twisting in unnatural knots. By nightfall, she was gone, leaving her husband and 2 small children behind. Her funeral was rushed. The humid air hastened the decomposition of her body, and by the 5th day, the stench was unbearable. The villagers, unable to endure it any longer, buried her in the village graveyard under the shadow of an ancient banyan tree. At first, everything seemed to return to normal. But soon the villagers noticed something strange. A foul, unmistakable stench began wafting from the graveyard, the same putrid odor that had plagued the funeral. Those who passed by on their way to the fields spoke of a sense of unease, as if unseen eyes followed their every step. The graveyard, once a place of quiet reverence, became a spot to avoid at all costs. One evening, a woman named May and her husband were returning from their farm. As they approached the graveyard, May stopped in her tracks, wrinkling her nose. "Do you smell that?" she asked her husband, her voice trembling. "It's probably just the rain stirring up the earth," he replied, brushing off her fears. "Let's keep moving, we have work to do." Then she heard it, a sound so chilling it made her blood run cold. Another voice joined hers in mourning, distant but unmistakably human. It seemed to come from the hill beyond their farm. May froze, straining to hear. The cries were hauntingly familiar, echoing her own grief in a harrowing chorus. Panicked, she bolted the door and clutched a sickle for protection. The cries grew louder, closer. The air grew thick with a putrid stench she recognized all too well, the same smell that had lingered in the graveyard. Suddenly the door creaked open. A shadowy figure stepped inside, its hair wild and tangled, its face obscured. It sobbed and wailed as it shuffled toward the bed where May had laid her husband's body. Terrified, May slipped out through the back and ran as fast as her legs could carry her. The cries chased her all the way to the village. By dawn, May, her in-laws and a group of villagers returned to the farmhouse. Inside, they found her husband's body mutilated beyond recognition. His abdomen had been hollowed out, his organs gone as though something or someone had devoured them. Fearing another tragedy, they decided not to hold a traditional funeral. They hastily buried his remains in a shallow grave at the edge of the graveyard. But curiosity got the better of them. Unable to shake their unease, the villagers decided to check the grave of the woman who had died from the mushroom soup. What they found chilled them to their core. The grave was empty. The earth had been disturbed from within as though she had clawed her way out. Terrified, the villagers fled back to the safety of their homes, knowing deep down that whatever haunted their village was far from over. Some say her restless spirit still roams the graveyard, hungry for something only the living can provide.
Welcome back, everyone. Tonight we delve into the unsettling realm of the nursing profession, where the veil between life and death grows thin. Real accounts from nurses who have seen what others might dismiss. A flicker of a shadow in an empty room, a patient whispering to someone unseen, or the chilling final moments that suggest something otherworldly. Prepare yourselves for tales from the hospital's darkest corners, stories that are as haunting as they are unforgettable. Turn off the lights, settle in, and get ready to explore the eerie side of the nursing world. Let's begin. Hospitals are places of healing and hope, but they're also where life meets death, a realm where the veil between the living and the unknown grows thin. That's what I couldn't stop thinking about when I met Joanne. Joanne arrived one quiet afternoon in the labor and delivery department on the 3rd floor. She was 47 and visibly pregnant, but her demeanor was far from the usual glow of an expectant mother. Her face was drawn, her dark eyes ringed with exhaustion, as if she hadn't rested in weeks. Her expression was empty, almost lifeless. "Joanne?" I asked gently, trying to confirm her name. She didn't respond, not the first time, not the second. Only after asking for the 4th time did she mutter, almost reluctantly, "Joanne." Something about her unsettled me right away. She refused to lie in the bed, choosing instead to sleep upright in a chair. When I glanced at her chart, her history only deepened my unease. Paranoia, depression, hallucinations. She wasn't just battling physical exhaustion. Her mind seemed tormented. Still, I had a job to do. "I'll be back to start an IV," I told her, keeping my tone calm and professional. She didn't look at me, just nodded slightly. When I returned, Joanne was slumped in her chair, her head hanging low, hair falling over her face. She was snoring softly. I gently woke her, explaining I needed her arm for the IV. Without a word, she lifted her left arm, keeping her head down as I worked, and then she spoke. "The hospital," she whispered, her voice raspy but deliberate. is a gateway for life and death. Below us, the ICU, where people die. Here, on this floor, new life begins. A chill ran down my spine. I froze for a moment, unsure of how to respond. Her words lingered in the sterile air, heavy and foreboding. As I finished the IV, she lifted her head and locked eyes with me for the first time. "If it's between me and my baby," she asked, her voice sharp and eerily calm, "who would you save?" Her question caught me off guard. I stammered, "Why would you ask that?" She leaned forward, her eyes darkening as her tone turned venomous. "Listen, you B," she hissed. "Between me and my baby, who would you save?" Her sudden shift was unnerving. I tried to de-escalate the situation, telling her I couldn't answer such a question. But she wouldn't let it go. "You must choose," she demanded, her voice rising, echoing in the small room. "The decision is yours, today. Say it. Who will live and who will die?" I could feel my hands trembling. Without thinking, I blurted out, "I'd save the baby." Joanne leaned back, a twisted grin spreading across her face. Pointing to herself, she said with chilling finality, "Since you chose the baby, then this woman will die." I left the room, shaken, and immediately reported the incident to my supervisor. He went in to speak with her, but when he came out, he just shook his head. "Joanne's not well," he said quietly. That evening the doctor arrived and Joanne was taken to the delivery room. Against all odds, she gave birth to a healthy baby girl. But her ordeal wasn't over. Shortly after, she began hemorrhaging uncontrollably. They rushed her into surgery, but her condition only worsened. She was transferred to the ICU, directly below our floor. Joanne didn't survive the night. The autopsy found no drugs in her system. By all accounts, she was physically healthy, apart from her mental health struggles. But her last words haunted me. "Since you chose the baby, this woman will die." Who was she talking about? Herself? Or someone else entirely? As nurses, we often dismiss patients' claims of being pursued by something unseen as symptoms of their mental illness. But with Joanne, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more, something darker, something I couldn't explain. "Hospitals are a gateway," she said, "between life and death." And on that night, I wondered if Joanne had crossed through it, but not alone. There's something unsettling about old buildings, especially those that have housed suffering and death. I've worked at a nursing facility for 13 years, but this place isn't just a home for the sick and elderly. Before it became what it is today, it was a tuberculosis ward, a place where countless lives ended in gasping breaths. After that, it served as a children's hospital. Now, it's a strange blend of past and present, where the echoes of those lives seem to linger, refusing to fade. Late at night, when most of the lights are dimmed, many staff members, and even patients, report hearing the faint sound of children laughing, their soft footsteps running down the hallways. At first you might dismiss it as creaking floors or an overactive imagination, but those who've worked here long enough know better. Here's the eerie part. Every year between December and January, the laughter stops. No footsteps, no giggles, just silence. And when the children go quiet, we know what's coming. Death seems to creep through the halls during those months, taking patients one by one. It's always 3. Always. One January, a man was admitted for physical therapy after knee surgery. He seemed fine, apart from being a little irritable about his pain. He was placed in room 7, a room known among staff for being strange. On his first night, he called out to us, complaining that a tall, thin girl with long, sharp fingernails was pinching him. The description sent a shiver down my spine. No one like that existed in the building. He insisted on keeping all the lights on, his room light, the hallway light, even the bathroom light. But still, he claimed she was there, standing in the corner, watching him. We didn't have the heart to tell him Room 7 had a reputation. Other patients who stayed there often spoke of the tall girl, too. Some described her as shadowy and featureless. Others said her long fingers were what stood out the most. Whatever she was, her presence unnerved everyone who stayed in that room. By the third night, his pleas became desperate. He begged us to move him, swearing that she was pinching him harder, leaving bruises. But the facility was at capacity. There was nowhere else for him to go. On the fourth night, everything was unnervingly quiet. No calls for help, no complaints, just silence. At midnight, one of the CNAs went to check on him. Moments later, I heard her scream. When I ran to Room 7, I found him lying in bed, his eyes wide open, foam bubbling at his mouth. He was alive but barely responsive. As we rushed to stabilize him, we noticed something chilling. Large, nickel-sized bruises scattered across his body. They were fresh, as if someone, or something, had been pinching him all over. The paramedics arrived and took him to the hospital, but what they discovered later made everything worse. The man had fragments of his own skin under his fingernails, as though he'd been clawing and pinching himself. But here's the thing. None of us believed he did it to himself. The man passed away a few weeks later from complications unrelated to his stay. Still, I can't shake the feeling that whatever haunted him in Room 7 didn't leave when he did. And that brings me back to the children. When their laughter stops, when the hallways grow silent, I wonder if they're hiding from something darker, something more sinister that roams these halls when the nights stretch long and the cold settles deep. Because when the children disappear, death is never far behind. In 1994, I was a home health nurse, and that year delivered an experience I'd never forget, a story that still sends shivers down my spine. It started with an ordinary assignment. My patients were often Hmong families, adjusting to American life. On this particular day, I was sent to care for an elderly woman who was paralyzed from the waist down after a stroke 2 years earlier. She had a deep wound on her lower back that required attention. Her house stood out the moment I arrived. 2 straw dolls dangled from the front door, effigies meant to ward off evil spirits. The sight made me pause. A cold breeze brushing against me, but I knocked anyway. A frail voice called out after a long silence. "Who is it?" I explained that I was the nurse here to care for her wound. The door creaked open slowly. She sat in a wheelchair, her skeletal frame barely filling the seat. Her wrists were adorned with red strings, talismans meant to protect her from malevolent forces. Inside, the air was heavy, carrying an inexplicable tension. I asked if anyone else was home. She shook her head. Her son and daughter-in-law were at work, the kids at school. She was alone. We moved to her bedroom, and as I prepared to examine her, she turned to me with piercing eyes. "Don't be afraid when I show you," she murmured. "You see, my husband followed us here after he died. In Southeast Asia, he passed and became a tiger spirit. He's trying to take me with him. That's why I've grown a tail." Her words hit me like a chill in the middle of a sweltering day. I forced a smile, trying to rationalize her statement. "A tail?" I asked cautiously. She nodded solemnly. "You'll see." As she lay on the bed and turned toward the wall, I prepared myself for what she was referring to. What I saw, however, wasn't supernatural. Her exposed tailbone protruded through her skin, a wound from prolonged sitting and lying down. The smell of decaying flesh hung in the air. I cleaned the wound, dressed it, and explained gently that what she referred to as a tail was simply her tailbone exposed from her condition. She listened, nodding, but her expression was unreadable. Then as I finished, a sound froze me in place. Heavy, deliberate footsteps thudding above us in the attic. I glanced upward, my heart hammering. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. She reached for my wrist and squeezed it lightly. "That's him," she said calmly, almost matter-of-factly. "He's here, staying in the attic. Whenever I'm alone, he comes back as a tiger. You can hear him, but don't acknowledge it. Pretend you don't." The footsteps continued, moving with the weight of something much larger than a man. My rational mind screamed for an explanation, but in that moment, all logic faded. I didn't know what to say. She reassured me with eerie calm, explaining that this wasn't unusual. In every house they'd lived in, the heavy steps would return, pacing above her, waiting. I wanted to stay, but duty called me to my next patient. She urged me to go. "It's just my husband," she said, smiling faintly. "He won't hurt me." For the next 4 months, I visited her weekly. Each time I heard the same ominous sounds in the attic. She never seemed afraid, but I was always uneasy. Then one day, I learned she had passed away in her sleep. After her death, I couldn't help but wonder, was it really her condition that took her? Or did the tiger spirit finally claim what it had been waiting for? That house still haunts my memories, and the sound of heavy footsteps above me will never feel the same again. Nights in the hospital have a way of feeling heavy, like the air is filled with whispers from the past. That night was no different. I had been a nurse long enough to grow numb to death, to learn how to leave the grief at work. But every so often a patient would leave a mark, a weight that clung to you, no matter how much you tried to shake it off. Sam was one of those patients. He was only 28, but already teetering on the edge of life. Years of alcohol and drug abuse had ravaged his body, his liver, heart, and kidneys, failing him all at once. He had lost his wife, his kids, his job, everything that once anchored him. Now he lived with his father, the only person left who hadn't turned away. That night, Sam was my only patient, and I was tasked with running a slow dialysis treatment for him. He seemed calm as he lay in bed watching TV, his hollow eyes occasionally flickering toward me as we talked. He opened up about his life, about the crushing guilt that drove him to the bottle. Years ago, Sam had been a police officer. One day he'd asked his best friend to trade shifts. His friend agreed, but on that shift, his friend was killed in the line of duty. Sam had carried the weight of that decision ever since. He tried to drown it in alcohol, but the guilt only grew heavier, pulling him deeper into despair. At 11 p.m., his father arrived. Sam was already asleep, so his father and I stepped outside to talk. He shared more about Sam's downward spiral, the drinking, the refusal to get help, the pain of watching his son destroy himself. There was a sadness in his voice, a helplessness that mirrored the hopelessness in Sam's eyes. For 3 nights, I cared for Sam. We talked often, and I felt like I got to know him, not just as a patient, but as a person. A broken man, desperate for redemption. On the 3rd night, his condition took a turn for the worse. At 3 a.m., while I was performing dialysis, Sam took his last breath. We cleaned him up, prepared his body for the morgue, and then I was sent home early. But as I drove through the quiet streets, I couldn't shake the weight of his death. I told myself to let it go, to leave the sadness behind like I always did. But this time I couldn't. I pulled over near a canal, deciding to fish for a while to clear my head before going home to my sleeping wife and child. The night was still, the kind of stillness that feels unnatural. I cast my line into the water and waited, the silence wrapping around me like a heavy blanket. Then out of nowhere, the flash of headlights broke the darkness. A police car pulled up behind me, and a young officer stepped out. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice steady but kind. I nodded, explaining that I was just taking a moment to myself before heading home. We chatted for a while. He introduced himself as Officer Paul and shared a little about the canal, mentioning that his grandfather had helped build it. He even joked about the type of bait I was using, telling me to try something different next time. His presence was comforting, almost too comforting. When he shook my hand and turned to leave, I felt a strange pang of gratitude. But as I glanced back to watch him go, something chilled me to my core. His car was gone. I never heard the engine start, never saw the headlights fade into the distance. One moment he was there, and the next, it was as if he had vanished into thin air. Shaken, I packed up my things and drove home, the encounter replaying in my mind like a broken record. The next day, while I was on shift, Sam's father called. He asked if I could retrieve Sam's laptop from the room he had passed in. I found it in the closet and handed it over when he arrived. His eyes were red and puffy, his grief written all over his face. He thanked me for taking care of his son, and I offered my condolences. Then, almost hesitantly, I asked him about Sam's friend, the one who had died in his place. His reply sent a shiver down my spine. "Paul," he said softly. "Officer Paul." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The name, the presence, the way the officer had appeared and disappeared, it all clicked in an instant. Sam's father thanked me again and walked away, leaving me standing there, paralyzed by the realization. Had Paul come to comfort me, to watch over Sam's last hours? Or was his presence a reminder of the guilt that had haunted Sam to his grave? To this day, I don't have an answer, but every now and then, I think of that night, of Officer Paul, the vanished car, and the eerie, inescapable feeling that I had brushed against something far beyond my understanding. It was 2 a.m. when I first felt it, an icy, almost suffocating presence in the room. It wasn't the kind of chill you get from a draft. No, this was something deeper, like the air had thickened around me, pressing against my chest. I couldn't place it, but something in the silence felt wrong. I had just finished a long shift at the hospital. As a nurse, I was used to the death and despair that lurked behind every corner, but nothing could have prepared me for the twisted sense of fate that would unfold in my life, leaving me haunted by guilt and an eerie connection I couldn't understand. It started with my brother, Alex. Ever since he moved in with me and our mother, things had been strained. Alex, 38, was a mess. Divorced, depressed, obese, diabetic, and plagued with high blood pressure. He refused to help out around the house or get a job, instead isolating himself in his room, playing video games and drinking beer. His unhealthy habits only made his medical conditions worse, and our life insurance premiums skyrocketed because of him. But what really bugged me was how he seemed to be throwing his life away. I worked at the hospital, and every day I saw the effects of people with his condition. The pandemic hit hard in 2020, and I couldn't help but think about Alex. The virus targeted people with underlying health issues like his: obesity, diabetes, high blood pressure. He was at risk, and I was terrified for him. I did everything I could to keep the virus away from home, constantly washing my hands, avoiding contact, and staying in my room when I wasn't at work. But no matter how careful I was, fate has a way of catching up with you. I eventually got sick. My coworkers, young, healthy nurses, had caught the virus and only experienced mild symptoms. I, on the other hand, knew I was at risk. After all, I was constantly around patients who had it. My manager told me to stay home for 2 weeks and avoid contact with my family. So I did. But one night, feverish and restless, I couldn't sleep. The cough, the headache, it was unbearable. I stumbled out of my room and noticed Alex was still up, hunched over his video game console. I grabbed 2 beer bottles from the fridge, desperate to escape my misery, and knocked on his door. He looked up and smiled, a little too drunk to realize how sick I actually was. I handed him one of the beers, and for a while, we just talked, laughing about nothing, playing video games until my body begged for rest. I couldn't stop coughing, though. It rattled through my chest, making it harder and harder to breathe. Eventually I left, taking some Benadryl to calm myself and heading back to my room. The next day, Alex was coughing so badly he could hardly breathe. It only took a few days before he was in the hospital. But that wasn't the worst part. Fast forward 2 years, and I was trying to move on with life, still burdened by the $180,000 life insurance payout from Alex's untimely death. The pandemic had claimed him. He was a casualty of his own choices, but that didn't make the loss any easier. It was New Year's Eve, and I was at a friend's party, trying to forget, trying to enjoy myself. The alcohol was flowing, and as midnight struck, I joined in the celebration, downing a beer to ring in the new year. By 2 a.m., the people began leaving, but I wasn't ready to go home. I felt a little buzzed, but nothing I couldn't handle. I decided to drive, thinking the roads would be empty this late at night. But as I turned onto the highway ramp, something felt off. Instead of following the road straight, my car veered into a circle, heading directly into oncoming traffic. I didn't even realize it at first. The highway was empty, except for a few cars, which swerved violently to avoid me, their high beams flashing in warning. My mind was foggy, and I didn't understand what was happening until I saw him. A blue car appeared beside me, matching my speed. The interior light flickered on, and I saw the face of a man smiling at me. Too familiar. His face was framed by the glow of the dashboard. It was Alex. His eyes locked onto mine as he sped up, only to slow down again, then speed up once more, still smiling. That's when everything snapped back into focus. It couldn't be him. He was dead. I slammed the brakes, swerving hard to the left to avoid 2 oncoming trucks. My car skidded up onto the train tracks, rocks flying beneath me. My heart raced as I pulled over, gasping for air, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I knew I was drunk, but what I had just experienced couldn't be a result of alcohol. The blue car, the smile, it couldn't have been real. I drove home that night, shaken, but somehow I made it without being stopped. I didn't dream that night, but when I did sleep the next night I dreamed of Alex. He came to me, his voice soft, but carrying a sense of finality. "I'm leaving for good," he told me, his words heavy with something I couldn't explain. "But I'm here to make sure you're okay." He told me to take care of myself, that I was the youngest, and my mother would need me. He reminded me of the responsibility I had, and then he was gone. I woke up crying, my chest heavy with guilt I couldn't shake. Every day since, I've been haunted by his words, by the vision of his smiling face that night. I don't know if it was a ghostly visit or just the result of too much alcohol, but the weight of his death still lingers. And every time I drive, every time I hear the sound of a car speeding past, I can't shake the feeling that Alex is still with me, watching, waiting. And no matter what I do, no matter how hard I try to move on, I'll never escape the shadow of his presence.